In 1499, the city of Tenochtitlan was the largest metropolis in the Western Hemisphere, a glittering island capital of perhaps 200,000 people, built on water, governed by gods, and feared by every nation within 1,000 miles. 22 years later, it was rubble. The story of how one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history was undone in roughly 700 days is not simply a story about conquest. It is a story about the fragility of empires, the weight of belief, the cruelty of disease, and the strange, irreversible moments when two worlds collide, and neither one survives the impact entirely intact. Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. Tonight we're going somewhere that most history classes only visit for a paragraph or two, before moving on to something else. And that has always struck me as one of the great injustices of how we teach the past. Because the civilization we're going to explore tonight was not a footnote. It was not a primitive backdrop to someone else's story of conquest and discovery. It was, by almost any measure you care to apply, one of the most remarkable human achievements ever constructed on this planet. We are going to talk about the Aztecs. And before we go any further, I want to say something that I think is important. The people we call the Aztecs did not call themselves that. The name comes from Aztlan, the mythic homeland from which their ancestors supposedly migrated, and it was applied to them largely by later historians. The people themselves, the core group at the heart of this civilization, called themselves the Mexica. You will hear me use both names tonight, because both have their place in this story, and I want you to understand from the very beginning that we are talking about real human beings, with their own names for themselves, their own history of themselves, their own understanding of who they were and why they mattered. And they mattered enormously. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you are settling in, tell me where you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I always love seeing the spread of places that join us for these late-night dives into history. Someone once wrote to me from a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, someone else from a town in rural Norway at 4 a.m. I find that remarkable, that these stories told in the dark find their way to so many different kinds of quiet. Now, dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum softly in the background, maybe make yourself a drink, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. The story of the Aztecs is a story about ambition on a scale that is almost difficult to comprehend. It is a story about a people who arrived in the Valley of Mexico as nobody, as wanderers that everyone else despised, and who within 2 centuries had built the most powerful empire the Americas had ever seen. It is a story about a cosmology so rich, so demanding, so philosophically intricate that it shaped every single aspect of daily life, from the moment you woke up to the moment you died, and arguably for quite some time after that as well. It is also, unavoidably, a story about destruction, about the arrival of a small group of Spanish soldiers under a commander who had no official authorization to be there, about the collapse of something vast and ancient and extraordinary in a span of time so brief that even today, 5 centuries later, historians are still trying to explain how it happened, about what is lost when a civilization falls and who gets to write the history of that fall. We are going to take our time tonight. We are going to start at the very beginning, long before the Aztecs themselves appeared on the scene, and we are going to follow the story all the way through to its end, and then beyond the end to what survives, to what endures, to what the Aztecs left behind in the soil and the language and the faces of modern Mexico. This is a long story. It is a beautiful story. It is sometimes a very dark story. But it is one of the most important stories the human past has to offer. So let us begin. The world before the Aztecs, Mesoamerica's ancient stage. To understand the Aztecs, you have to understand the world they inherited. The region we now call Mesoamerica, a term that roughly encompasses central and southern Mexico, along with parts of Guatemala, Belize, Honduras and El Salvador, was not an empty stage waiting for its most famous performers to arrive. By the time the people who would become the Aztecs wandered into the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 12th or 13th century of the Common Era, that valley had already been home to extraordinary civilizations for more than 2,000 years. The Aztecs were not the beginning of Mesoamerican greatness. They were in many ways its final and most dramatic act. The landscape itself is worth pausing on, because it shaped everything. The Valley of Mexico sits at an elevation of roughly 7,300 feet above sea level, a vast basin surrounded on 3 sides by mountains and volcanoes, some of them still active, some of them snow-capped even in the warmth of spring. The valley floor in the pre-Hispanic period was dominated by a system of interconnected lakes, the largest of which was Lake Texcoco, a shallow, brackish body of water that shimmered in the high-altitude light, and that would one day become the site of the most improbable city ever built. The climate here is temperate, sometimes startlingly cold at night, often clear and bright during the day. The soil, particularly in the regions fed by mountain streams and enriched by centuries of sediment, is extraordinarily fertile, and the surrounding mountains provided timber, obsidian for tools and weapons, and a natural barrier against outside incursion that made the valley feel, to the peoples who lived there, like the center of the world, which, in their cosmology, it very much was. The first great civilization of Mesoamerica that we know in any real detail was the Olmec, flourishing along the Gulf Coast of Mexico from roughly 1200 to 400 BCE. The Olmecs are sometimes called the mother culture of Mesoamerica, which is a title that historians debate quite energetically, but the point stands that they established patterns and practices that would echo through every subsequent civilization in the region. They built large ceremonial centers, they carved enormous stone heads, some of them weighing up to 40 tons, with features that have fascinated and puzzled scholars for generations. They developed early forms of the ritual calendar that would later become central to Aztec religious life. They traded widely, carried jade and obsidian across hundreds of miles, and established a template for the relationship between religious authority and political power that Mesoamerica would never fully abandon. After the Olmecs, the stage shifted, and the most dramatic thing that appeared on it was a city that, even today, remains in many ways mysterious. Teotihuacan. Located about 30 miles northeast of modern Mexico City, Teotihuacan was, at its peak around the 4th and 5th centuries of the Common Era, one of the largest cities in the world, not just in the Americas, in the world. Its population is estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people, which puts it in the same bracket as the great cities of the Roman Empire at a similar moment in time. Its main avenue, which later peoples would call the Street of the Dead, runs for more than 2 miles in a perfectly straight line between two enormous pyramid complexes. The Pyramid of the Sun, rising nearly 220 feet, is among the largest structures ever built in the ancient Americas. And here is the thing that makes Teotihuacan so haunting. We do not know who built it. We do not know what language they spoke or what they called themselves. The Aztecs, when they encountered the ruins of Teotihuacan centuries after its collapse, believed it was a city built by giants, or perhaps by the gods themselves. They gave it the name Teotihuacan, which in the Nahuatl language means something like the place where men become gods. They made pilgrimages there. They incorporated its imagery and mythology into their own religious system. They regarded its ruins with the same mixture of awe and reverence that later Europeans would feel standing in the ruins of Rome. Teotihuacan collapsed around the 6th century of the Common Era, apparently due to a combination of internal conflict, possible elite overthrow and environmental stress. Parts of the city were deliberately burned, and then the great urban population dispersed, and the city that had dominated Mesoamerica for centuries began its long, slow return to silence. Into the space left by Teotihuacan's collapse came a kaleidoscope of competing cultures and city-states. The Maya, of course, were flourishing in the south and east, building their own extraordinary civilization of city-states, astronomical observatories, and a writing system that was the most sophisticated in the Americas. The Maya world overlapped and intersected with Central Mexican civilization in complicated ways, and Mayan ideas about time, prophecy, and the cosmos would filter northward and westward and leave traces in Aztec religious thought. But the culture that most directly shaped the world the Aztecs inherited was the Toltec. The Toltecs are, frankly, one of the most confusing subjects in all of Mesoamerican history, and I say that as someone who finds the entire subject delightfully confusing to begin with. Part of the problem is that by the time the Aztecs were writing about the Toltecs, centuries had passed and the boundary between history and mythology had become thoroughly, perhaps irretrievably, blurred. The Aztecs regarded the Toltecs as the supreme civilization, the golden age before their own, the culture from which all art, all knowledge, and all civilization derived. In Nahuatl, the word Toltec became synonymous with artisan, with skilled craftsperson, with anyone who made beautiful things. To call someone a Toltec was to pay them the highest possible compliment. The actual historical Toltecs appear to have been based at a city called Tula, located in the modern state of Hidalgo, north of the Valley of Mexico. Tula flourished roughly from 900 to 1150 of the Common Era before it too collapsed, probably due to some combination of drought, internal conflict and pressure from northern peoples migrating southward. The great feathered serpent deity known as Quetzalcoatl was associated with Tula, and a legendary ruler priest of the same name became one of the most powerful figures in the religious imagination of the Aztecs. A figure whose identity, whose departure, and whose promised return would play a fateful role in the events of 1519. So by the time the Mexica people arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 12th or early 13th century, they were entering a landscape already thick with history, a landscape dotted with the ruins of collapsed civilizations and the living remains of others, a landscape crossed by trade routes, contested by rival city-states, and saturated with a shared cultural and religious framework that had been developing for well over 1,000 years. They arrived as outsiders to all of it. They arrived as nobodies, and they would leave as the people who defined it all. A people without a home. The Mexica origins. There is something almost poignant about the early history of the Mexica. The people who would one day rule an empire of perhaps 6 million souls, who would build a capital city that left the soldiers of the most powerful nation in Europe speechless with astonishment, began their story as wanderers that nobody wanted. Every major civilization has its origin myth. The Romans had Romulus and Remus and the she-wolf. The Israelites had Abraham and the covenant in the wilderness. The Mexica had Aztlan, the place of herons, the place of whiteness, depending on how you interpret the etymology, was the mythic homeland from which the Mexica people claim to have originated. Its actual location has been debated for 5 centuries and is still not settled. Some scholars place it in the northwest of Mexico, possibly in the modern state of Nayarit or Sinaloa. Others think it was somewhere in the American Southwest. Others, a small but enthusiastic minority, have suggested it might be partly or entirely mythological, a symbolic homeland rather than a geographic one. What the mythology tells us is this. The Mexica people were one of 7 Nahua-speaking tribes who left Aztlan together on a long migration southward, guided by their patron deity Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, god of the sun and of war, who communicated with them through the medium of a sacred bundle carried by his priests. The migration was not a journey with a known destination. It was a pilgrimage without a map, sustained by divine instruction and the promise that they would know their home when they found it, because they would see an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. The historical reality of the migration is probably this. The Mexica were one of a number of Chichimec peoples, which was essentially what settled Mesoamerican civilizations called the semi-nomadic tribes of the north, a word that carried a strong flavor of barbarian or uncivilized about it. These northern peoples had been drifting southward into central Mexico for centuries, filling in the power vacuums left by the collapse of Teotihuacan and later the Toltecs. The Mexica were among the last of these groups to arrive, and by the time they got to the Valley of Mexico sometime around 1250 or 1270 of the Common Era, all the good real estate was already taken, and the people who already lived there made it very clear that the Mexica were not welcome. The early centuries of Mexica history in the Valley of Mexico are a story of almost continuous humiliation. They settled briefly in one place, only to be driven out by neighbours who found them threatening or annoying or simply inconvenient. They served as mercenaries for stronger peoples, renting out their considerable military skills in exchange for the right to exist in a region that did not particularly want them. They were regarded as crude, aggressive, and religiously alarming, because even at this early stage the Mexica practiced human sacrifice in a manner and on a scale that their more settled neighbours found excessive. And that is saying something, because human sacrifice was not exactly unknown in Mesoamerica. The Mexica just seemed to be particularly enthusiastic about it. There is a story, recorded in several early colonial sources and almost certainly either embellished or entirely legendary, that captures the flavour of how the Mexica were perceived by their neighbours during this period. At some point during their wanderings, the Mexica were guests of the powerful Culhuacan kingdom, whose ruler offered them land to settle on in a region deliberately chosen because it was infested with snakes, apparently in the hope that the snakes would solve the Mexica problem for him. The Mexica, being the Mexica, ate the snakes and settled in quite happily. The ruler of Culhuacan, somewhat reluctantly impressed, later gave them his daughter to seal an alliance. The Mexica promptly sacrificed her to their goddess Tosi and invited the ruler to the ceremony. He arrived to find a priest dancing in his daughter's skin. He chased them out of the territory immediately, which was probably the expected outcome, and possibly the intended one. I'm going to say that again. He arrived to find a priest dancing in his daughter's skin. Now, I want to be careful here, because sources from this period are deeply complicated, often recorded a century after the events they describe and heavily influenced by both indigenous political agendas and Spanish colonial interests. This story might be exaggerated, it might be symbolic, it might be entirely invented. But the fact that it was told and retold and became part of the foundational mythology of the Mexica people tells you something important about how they understood themselves and how they wanted others to understand them. They were not trying to be liked. They were trying to be feared. And then, around the year 1325, something changed. The eagle on the cactus, finding Tenochtitlan. The founding of Tenochtitlan is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of urban civilization, and it begins with a vision on a swampy, inhospitable, utterly unpromising island in the middle of a shallow lake. According to Mexica tradition, it was a priest named Tenoch who first saw the sign. The eagle, perched on a prickly pear cactus, devouring a serpent. The sign that Huitzilopochtli had promised, the marker of the place where the long migration would end and the great city would begin. The island was small. The water around it was brackish and full of reeds. There was no arable land to speak of. The neighbouring peoples who controlled the lakeshore probably found it amusing that the Mexica, having been pushed from every desirable location in the valley, had decided to settle on a patch of swampy nothing that no one else had wanted. The joke, as it turned out, was on them. The image of the eagle on the cactus is, to this day, at the centre of the Mexican national flag. Think about that for a moment. Of all the things modern Mexico could have chosen to put on its flag, all the symbols it might have drawn from 5 centuries of post-conquest history, it chose the founding vision of the Mexica. The image from a moment in the early 14th century, when a group of desperate, displaced people looked at a mudflat in a lake and decided that this, improbably, impossibly, was where they were meant to be. They named the island Tenochtitlan, which translates roughly as the place of the prickly pear cactus, or in some interpretations, the place of the rock cactus. And from this foundation, in the year 1325, or possibly 1345 since sources disagree on the date, which is entirely typical of this period of history, they began to build. The engineering achievement that followed was extraordinary, and I want to spend a moment on it because it often does not get the attention it deserves. Tenochtitlan was built on an island. It was then expanded off the island by creating artificial land, the famous chinampas, which get called floating gardens in most popular accounts, though they were not technically floating. The chinampas were built by driving wooden stakes into the lake bed, anchoring a framework of woven reeds and branches, and piling that framework high with lake mud and vegetation, an organic material, until you had a raised plot of extraordinarily fertile growing land separated from neighbouring plots by narrow canals through which canoes could pass. This system was not invented by the Mexica. It had precedents in the region. But the Mexica expanded it on a scale that was genuinely unprecedented, eventually creating entire neighbourhoods of these artificial plots, extending the effective land area of Tenochtitlan far beyond the limits of the original island. The chinampas were also spectacularly productive. The lake mud was rich with nutrients. The water was constantly available for irrigation. You could grow multiple crops per year on a chinampa, and the food production they enabled was one of the things that allowed Tenochtitlan to sustain a population that would eventually make it the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. The city was connected to the mainland by a series of great causeways, raised roads built across the surface of the lake that could accommodate enormous amounts of foot traffic. The 2 main causeways ran roughly north-south and east-west, meeting at the ceremonial centre of the city, and they were so wide that 8 horsemen could ride abreast on them, as Spanish soldiers would later marvel. Across these causeways flowed everything the city needed: food, building materials, tribute from conquered territories, merchants carrying goods from as far away as the Gulf Coast and the Pacific, and the endless stream of human beings that any great city requires to function. Water was a more complicated problem. Lake Texcoco was brackish, not fit to drink. The Mexica solved this with aqueducts, double pipe systems that carried fresh water from springs on the mainland into the heart of the city. The main aqueduct, which ran from the springs of Chapultepec on the western shore of the lake, was a genuine feat of hydraulic engineering, carrying a constant supply of clean water over a distance of several miles. One pipe would be closed for cleaning while the other continued to supply the city, an arrangement that impressed even the technically sophisticated Spaniards who encountered it in 1519. The city that grew up on and around this island in the course of the 14th and 15th centuries was organised around a sacred precinct at its heart, a walled ceremonial complex of temples, ball courts, skull racks, and priestly residences that covered roughly 40 acres. At the center of the sacred precinct rose the Great Temple, the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid dedicated to the two most important deities in the Mexica pantheon, Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, the rain god. The temple was rebuilt and enlarged with each new ruler, a practice that has actually been enormously helpful to modern archaeologists because it means the temple contains the remains of all its previous versions inside it, like a set of Russian nesting dolls made of volcanic stone and human blood. Around the sacred precinct spread the city itself. Neighborhoods divided by canals, markets, craft workshops, the palaces of the nobility, the houses of the common people, a zoological garden, which was apparently one of the things that most astonished the Spanish, because large, well-maintained collections of exotic animals were not something they had at home. Schools, because the Mexica had a public education system that provided schooling for both boys and girls, which was genuinely unusual for any civilization of this period. Bathhouses, hospitals, administrative buildings. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan had a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, depending on how you count. The city proper was home to perhaps 200,000, with another 100,000 or more living in the immediately surrounding lake communities. At a time when the largest city in Spain had a population of around 50,000, Tenochtitlan was simply on a different scale. It was one of the largest cities on Earth. All of this from a mudflat in a lake that nobody else wanted. The Triple Alliance, birth of an empire. You could tell the story of the Aztec Empire as a story about military conquest, and that would not be wrong exactly, but it would be incomplete. What turned the Mexica from a rising city-state into the dominant power of Mesoamerica was something more interesting than simple military supremacy. It was political genius. Specifically, it was the political genius of a triple alliance that was, in many ways, the most effective coalition government in pre-Columbian history. To understand how the Triple Alliance came to be, you need to understand the political landscape of the Valley of Mexico in the early 15th century. The dominant power in the valley at this time was not the Mexica. It was the Tepanec people, centered on the city of Azcapotzalco on the western shore of Lake Texcoco. The Tepanecs had built a powerful regional empire through the 14th century, and the Mexica of Tenochtitlan had for several decades been their subordinate allies, serving as military muscle in Tepanec campaigns in exchange for a share of the tribute and a degree of protected autonomy. It was an arrangement that worked tolerably well for both parties until it stopped working, which arrangements of this kind always eventually do. The man who changed everything was named Itzcoatl. His name means obsidian serpent, which is exactly the kind of name you want if you are planning to overthrow the regional hegemon and found an empire. Itzcoatl became Tlatoani, which is the Nahuatl term for ruler, of Tenochtitlan in 1427. He was immediately confronted with a crisis, because the Tepanec ruler Maxtla, who had just come to power after the assassination of his more Mexica-friendly predecessor, was making it very clear that the days of beneficial partnership were over. Itzcoatl's response to this crisis was shaped enormously by the man who served as his chief advisor, a figure named Tlacaelel. And Tlacaelel is one of those historical figures who genuinely changed the course of history, but whose name most people have never heard, which is a situation I find endlessly fascinating and slightly annoying on his behalf. Tlacaelel served as the Chihuahuatl, a title that translates roughly as Snake Woman, which was actually a high administrative office, and not as alarming as it sounds. He was the chief counselor and arguably the true architect of Aztec imperial ideology, serving under 4 successive rulers spanning decades. He declined the position of Tlatoani himself on at least one occasion when it was offered to him, apparently preferring to be the power behind the throne rather than the throne itself. The man understood something important about how power actually works. Tlacaelel's genius was not purely military, though he certainly contributed to military planning. His genius was ideological. He understood that for the Mexica to become truly dominant, they needed not just military victories but a story, a narrative that explained why Mexica dominance was not merely advantageous, but cosmically necessary. He is credited with a wholesale rewriting of Mexica history and religious ideology, suppressing earlier traditions that emphasized the Mexica's humble origins as wanderers, and replacing them with a grander narrative in which the Mexica were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, the people appointed by the sun god himself to sustain the universe through sacrifice, and therefore the people who rightfully ruled over all others. There is a passage in one of the early colonial sources in which Tlacaelel is described as ordering the burning of existing historical books and replacing them with new ones. This is the kind of detail that makes historians both excited and deeply cautious, because it suggests that the Mexica historical tradition we have access to was, at least in part, a political construction. It is something to keep in mind as we tell this story. The military campaign that launched the empire began around 1428. The Mexica formed an alliance with two other city-states, Texcoco on the eastern shore of the lake and the smaller Tlacopan on the western shore. Together, these three cities took on the Tepanecs. The war was relatively brief and completely decisive. Maxtla's forces were defeated, Azcapotzalco was sacked, the Tepanec Empire dissolved, and in its place emerged the Triple Alliance, formerly known in Nahuatl as the Excan-Tlahtoloyan, the three-place rulership. The division of spoils was pragmatic and elegant. Half of all tribute from conquered territories went to Tenochtitlan, a quarter went to Texcoco, a quarter went to Tlacopan. In practice, as the decades passed and Tenochtitlan grew more powerful, this was less a partnership of equals than a Tenochtitlan-led confederation with two important but decidedly junior partners. But the fiction of alliance was maintained, and it served a purpose. It meant that Texcoco's considerable intellectual and artistic tradition, which was in many ways the most sophisticated in the valley, was woven into the fabric of the empire rather than treated as an external culture to be suppressed. Under Itzcoatl, and then under his successor Montezuma I, who ruled from 1440 to 1469, the Triple Alliance launched the campaigns of conquest that would transform it from a regional power into an empire. City after city, people after people brought under the Aztec umbrella, the Morelos Valley, the Gulf Coast, Oaxaca. By the end of Moctezuma I's reign, the empire already extended from coast to coast, and the tribute flowing into Tenochtitlan was transforming the city from a remarkable place into an extraordinary one, and they were only getting started. The Flower Wars and the meaning of sacrifice. This is the chapter that people either find the most fascinating or the most difficult, and sometimes both at the same time, and that is entirely appropriate. Because human sacrifice is not a subject that admits easy or comfortable explanations, but it is a subject that demands serious engagement, because you cannot understand the Aztec world without understanding their relationship with sacrifice, and you cannot understand their relationship with sacrifice without understanding their cosmology, and their cosmology was one of the most elaborate and philosophically interesting systems of thought ever developed by any human civilization. So let's take a breath, dim the lights a little further, and try to enter into a worldview that is genuinely unlike anything most of us grew up with. The Aztecs understood the universe as something that required constant maintenance, not just morally or ethically, but physically, literally. The sun, in Aztec cosmology, did not simply rise each morning because that was what suns did. It rose because it was sustained by the energy of human blood and human hearts. Without that sustenance, it would fail, and if the sun failed, everything ended. Not just human civilization, but existence itself. This was not a metaphor. This was not poetry. This was physics, as the Aztecs understood physics. The cosmological framework behind this belief was deeply elaborate. The Aztecs believed that the current world, the one they and we inhabit, was the fifth world, the fifth sun, the fifth attempt at creation. The previous four suns had each ended in catastrophe. The first was destroyed by jaguars, the second by wind, the third by a rain of fire, the fourth by flood. Each previous creation had been wiped out because it was insufficient, because the gods who created it had not been able to sustain it. The fifth sun, the current one, had been created at Teotihuacan, that mysterious city of ruins that the Aztecs regarded with such reverence. According to the most important of the creation myths, two gods had sacrificed themselves by throwing themselves into a great fire to become the sun and moon. But the newly created celestial bodies were frozen, motionless, unable to move across the sky. The other gods, every single one of them, had to sacrifice themselves as well, pouring out their blood to give the sun and moon the energy to move, to begin the cycle of days and nights that made life possible. The gods gave their blood for creation, and therefore humanity, which the gods had also created, owed a debt of blood in return. This debt was called Nextlahualli, the payment, and human sacrifice was the payment. It was not cruelty, or not only cruelty, it was obligation. Cosmic accounting. Now, I want to be honest about something here. Understanding the ideological framework behind Aztec human sacrifice does not mean that we have to be comfortable with it, or that we have to pretend it was something other than what it was. People were killed. People died in pain and terror on the tops of pyramids. That is a real thing that happened to real human beings, and no amount of cosmological context erases that reality. But context matters for understanding, and the context is genuine and important. The scale of Aztec sacrifice is also worth being accurate about, because it has been significantly exaggerated by some sources, including 16th century Spanish ones that had obvious reasons to portray the Aztecs as monsters. The number that gets thrown around most often is that 20,000 people per year were sacrificed in the Aztec Empire. Some sources go higher. Modern scholars are generally skeptical of these figures and think the actual number was substantially lower, while still being significant. The largest single sacrifice event on record is the dedication of the Great Temple in 1487, at which point various sources claim that as many as 80,000 people were sacrificed over 4 days, which is almost certainly an exaggeration, possibly a very large one. What is not in doubt is that sacrifice was real, was central to Aztec religious life, was practiced on a regular basis, and was institutionalized in a way that had profound effects on the empire's foreign policy. And that brings us to the Flower Wars. The Flower Wars, Xochitlán and Nahuatl, were a distinctive and genuinely unusual form of institutionalized combat. They were not wars in the conventional sense of conflicts fought to conquer territory or destroy enemies. They were ritualized battles fought for the specific purpose of capturing prisoners for sacrifice. Both sides understood the purpose. Both sides participated. The object was to take prisoners, not to kill opponents on the battlefield. A warrior who killed an opponent rather than capturing them was actually considered to have wasted the opportunity. The Aztecs fought flower wars primarily against the Tlaxcalans and several other states in the region east and southeast of Tenochtitlan. These states were never conquered. It is sometimes suggested that the Aztecs deliberately left them unconquered, maintaining them as a permanent source of opponents for the flower wars, though some historians think this explanation is too convenient and that the Tlaxcalans were simply unconquerable, which is a theory that gains some support from the fact that they were still unconquered when the Spanish arrived and played a decisive role in the empire's downfall. The warriors who participated in the flower wars were among the most celebrated members of Aztec society. Military achievement was the primary path to social advancement for men outside the nobility. A warrior who captured 4 enemies in battle could join the prestigious orders of the Eagle Warriors or the Jaguar Warriors, the elite military brotherhoods whose regalia and status were among the most impressive in the empire. Capturing enemies was not just religiously significant, it was the foundation of social mobility. The sacrificial victims themselves occupied a complex and philosophically troubling position in Aztec thought. They were not merely killed, they were transformed. The person sacrificed to Huitzilopochtli became, in death, a companion of the sun, transformed into a hummingbird that accompanied the solar deity on his daily journey across the sky. This was, in the Aztec understanding, an honor, a death that had meaning and consequence and cosmic significance. Whether the person being sacrificed saw it the same way is a question we cannot answer, and probably should not assume. The Aztec relationship with death, sacrifice, and the cosmic obligation of blood was woven into every aspect of their culture, into their art, in which images of skulls and flowers and blood were not symbols of horror but symbols of vitality and renewal, into their festivals, which were extraordinarily numerous and elaborate, and which punctuated the religious calendar with a regularity that made every month sacred to one deity or another, into their philosophy, which asked the deepest possible questions about why the world existed and what obligation humanity owed to the forces that sustained it. It was a dark philosophy in some respects, and a beautiful one. And both of those things are true simultaneously. Tenochtitlan and the city that shouldn't exist. I want to take you on a walk. It is the year 1519, and it is a November morning, and you're crossing the Great Southern Causeway from the mainland toward Tenochtitlan. The causeway beneath your feet is wide enough for 10 people to walk abreast. On either side of you stretches the flat, glittering surface of Lake Texcoco, and on that surface you can see canoes, hundreds of them, their paddlers moving with unhurried efficiency through the early morning light, carrying produce and goods and people toward the markets of the city that is rising ahead of you. And the city is there, genuinely there, in the distance and then closer and then surrounding you, and it is unlike anything you've ever seen. This is the experience that Hernán Cortés and his soldiers would describe in their letters and reports, groping for comparisons because nothing in their European experience had prepared them for what they were looking at. They compared it to Venice because of the canals. They compared it to some enchanted vision from a novel because it seemed too extraordinary to be real. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of the soldiers who marched with Cortés and later wrote one of the most vivid eyewitness accounts of the conquest, described the moment his company first saw Tenochtitlan from a mountain pass and wrote that they did not know what to say or whether what they saw before them was real. Let us try to see it as they saw it. The city rose from the lake on its artificial foundations, a dense concentration of white plastered buildings reflecting the high-altitude sunlight with an almost painful brightness. The causeways ran toward it from 3 directions, north, south and west, and these causeways were crossed at regular intervals by wooden bridges that could be removed in case of military emergency, making the city extraordinarily defensible. Where the causeways entered the city, great gatehouses controlled the flow of traffic. The most overwhelming feature of the skyline, visible from miles away, was the Templo Mayor, the great temple that rose at the heart of the sacred precinct. It was a double pyramid, stepped in the characteristic Mesoamerican style painted in vivid colours, with 2 separate staircases climbing the steep front face to the twin shrines at the summit. The shrines were dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, whose shrine was painted red, and Tlaloc, the rain god, whose shrine was painted blue and white. Blood ran down the steps of Huitzilopochtli's shrine in a near-constant trickle during festival periods. The sacred precinct that surrounded the Templo Mayor was enclosed by a great wall, decorated with carved serpent heads, called the Cotepantli, the serpent wall. Inside this enclosure were at least 78 separate structures, other temples, ball courts, a skull rack called the Tzompantli, where the skulls of sacrificial victims were threaded on wooden poles and displayed in rows that apparently numbered in the many thousands, a school for the training of priests, quarters for the warrior orders, the Karmakak, the school for noble children where they received their religious and intellectual education. Outside the sacred precinct, the city unfolded in a roughly circular pattern, divided into 4 great quarters by the main causeways and their extensions through the city, and then further subdivided into neighbourhoods called Calpulli. The Calpulli was the fundamental unit of Aztec social organisation, something between a neighbourhood association and a clan organisation, responsible for local taxation, labour obligations, and the maintenance of its own local temple. Walking through the residential neighbourhoods of Tenochtitlan, you would pass houses built of stone and adobe, their walls plastered white and painted with decorative borders. The houses of the nobility were large, organised around interior courtyards with gardens and sometimes small ponds. The houses of commoners were smaller, but not by the standards of most pre-industrial urban housing anywhere in the world, notably squalid. The streets were kept clean to a degree that the Spanish, coming from cities in which sewage ran openly in the gutters, found almost incomprehensible. Actually, the Aztecs had a waste management system. Human waste was collected and used as fertilizer on the chinampas, and the canals were regularly dredged and cleaned. It was not a modern sanitation system, but it was vastly better than what European cities of comparable size offered at the same period. I mention this because it matters. It tells you something about the level of administrative sophistication required to run a city of 200,000 people, and it complicates the narrative of primitive savagery that European accounts were often inclined to impose on the Aztecs. The market of Tlatelolco was perhaps the single most astonishing thing the Spanish encountered in their entire experience of the Aztec world, which is saying quite a lot given everything else they encountered. Tlatelolco was a sister city to Tenochtitlan, located on the northern part of the same island, and its market was the commercial hub of the entire empire. The Spanish soldier Bernal Diaz wrote that the market was larger and better ordered than any market he had seen in his life, and he had been to Rome and Constantinople. The market operated under strict regulation. Inspectors moved through it constantly, checking weights and measures, settling disputes between buyers and sellers, maintaining the kind of commercial order that a market of this scale required. There were permanent sections for different goods. One area sold gold and silver jewellery, another sold slaves, another sold medicinal herbs, another sold food of every kind imaginable. The food deserves special attention, because Aztec cuisine was genuinely sophisticated and the market reflected that. You could buy maize in dozens of forms, from raw ears to ground mesa to prepared tortillas to tamales steamed in corn husks. You could buy tomatoes, which most of the world outside the Americas had never tasted, chili peppers in every variety, chocolate consumed as a bitter spiced drink rather than the sweet confection we know today, and valued so highly that cacao beans were used as a form of currency, squash, beans, avocados, turkeys, dogs raised specifically for eating, which I acknowledge is not a detail that everyone finds appealing, but is historically accurate and deserves mention. The chinampas that surrounded and extended the city were miraculous in their productivity, multiple crops per year, on soil enriched by lake sediment and organic waste, watered by the lake itself. The agricultural system that fed Tenochtitlan was one of the most productive in the world per acre, and it needed to be, because feeding 200,000 people on an island in a lake is not a simple logistical challenge. Beyond the city's practical achievements, Tenochtitlan was also a place of extraordinary beauty. The palace of Montezuma II, the ruler who greeted the Spanish in 1519, was described by Cortés himself as the finest building in the world, a complex of rooms and courtyards and gardens and pools that occupied an area several city blocks in extent. Aviaries kept hundreds of species of birds. The zoo housed jaguars, ocelots, pumas, eagles, and a wide variety of other animals, all cared for by professional keepers. Gardens were cultivated with hundreds of varieties of flowers, because the Aztecs had a genuine aesthetic passion for flowers that expressed itself in their art, their poetry, and their religious festivals in equal measure. This was the city that would be destroyed, and that fact, however necessary for the story we are telling, should be allowed to sit for a moment before we continue. The gods who ran the world. The Aztec pantheon is one of the richest and most complex religious systems in human history, and it is also one of the most difficult for an outsider to enter, because so much of it is so profoundly different from the religious frameworks that most of us carry, consciously or otherwise, from our cultural backgrounds. The Aztecs did not, strictly speaking, have a concept of religion as a separate domain of life. Their deities were not beings who existed in a separate supernatural realm, occasionally intervening in human affairs. They were the forces that constituted reality. Tlaloc was not just the god of rain, he was the agency by which rain existed. Huitzilopochtli was not just the god of the sun and war, he was the mechanism of the sun's daily journey. To separate the divine from the physical world was not, in Aztec thought, possible. The world was divine. The divine was the world. With that as context, let us meet some of the residents of the Aztec pantheon. Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south, was the patron deity of the Mexica people, and arguably the most important figure in the imperial religious system. He was the god of the sun in its aspect as a warrior, the solar deity who fought his way across the sky each day and descended into the underworld each night, only to be reborn the following morning. The myth at the heart of Huitzilopochtli's significance involves his birth. His mother, the earth goddess Coatlicue, became pregnant with him after a ball of feathers descended from the sky and touched her. Her other children, the stars, led by her daughter Coyolxauhqui, the moon, were outraged and attempted to kill her. Huitzilopochtli was born fully armed, a warrior at the instant of his birth, and immediately defeated his siblings, cutting off Coyolxauhqui's head and sending her body tumbling down a mountain. This myth was physically embodied in the Templo Mayor. At the base of the staircase leading to Huitzilopochtli's shrine, a great circular stone was carved with the image of Coyolxauhqui's dismembered body, just as she had been described in the myth. The bodies of sacrificial victims, after their hearts had been removed at the summit, were rolled down the stairs to land on or near this stone, reenacting Coyolxauhqui's defeat and symbolically feeding the sun with the blood it needed to complete its daily battle. The great Coyolxauhqui stone was rediscovered by workers digging a trench in downtown Mexico City in 1978, and is one of the most important archaeological finds of the 20th century. Tlaloc, the rain god, was in some ways even more ancient than Huitzilopochtli, with roots going back to Teotihuacan and possibly earlier. He was depicted with distinctive goggle eyes and elongated fangs, an image that recurs across Mesoamerican art spanning 2 millennia. He was the deity most associated with water in all its forms, from life-giving rain to destructive flood. The sacrifices made to Tlaloc were often children, specifically children who wept during the sacrifice, because their tears were understood as a kind of sympathetic magic, invoking the rainfall that the god controlled. This is one of those aspects of Aztec religious practice that is extremely difficult to engage with calmly, and I will not pretend otherwise. Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, was one of the oldest and most complex deities in the Mesoamerican tradition. He was associated with wind, with the planet Venus, with learning, with the arts, with the creation of humanity, and with the calendar. He was also associated with a specific historical or quasi-historical figure, a priest-king of the Toltecs who bore the same name and whose departure from Tula and promised return were woven into a body of mythology that would have catastrophic political consequences when the Spanish arrived. We will return to this. Tezcatlipoca, the smoking mirror, was in some ways Quetzalcoatl's opposite and nemesis. Where Quetzalcoatl was associated with order, learning and creation, Tezcatlipoca was associated with night, with darkness, with sorcery, with the jaguar, and with a kind of divine chaos that was not entirely malevolent but was certainly not safe. He was one of the supreme deities of the Aztec system, considered to be omniscient and able to see into the hearts of human beings through his obsidian mirror. His cult was both feared and propitiated. The Aztec religious calendar was a masterpiece of intellectual complexity. There were actually two interlocking calendars. The Xiuhpohualli, which was the 365-day solar calendar, divided into 18 months of 20 days plus 5 additional unlucky days at the end of the year, and the Tonalpohualli, the ritual calendar of 260 days, divided into 20 periods of 13 days, with each individual day having its own name, its own deity, its own prophetic significance. The name given to a child on the day of its birth was determined by the Tonalpohualli and shaped its entire life, influencing everything from its expected personality to its probable fate. These two calendars meshed together like gears, and every 52 years they returned to the same combined position, a moment called the calendar round. This moment was understood as a period of profound cosmic danger. The current world, the fifth sun, might not survive it. At the end of each 52-year cycle, the Aztecs performed the new fire ceremony, one of the most dramatic rituals in their entire religious calendar. In the new fire ceremony, all fires throughout the empire were extinguished. Cooking fires, hearth fires, temple fires, all of them put out. The world waited in darkness. Then, on a hilltop visible from Tenochtitlan, priests sacrificed a victim and used a fire drilling board to kindle a new fire in the open chest of the sacrifice. When the fire caught, it was distributed by runners carrying torches throughout the empire, and all the fires were relit. The world had survived another 52-year cycle. The fifth sun continued. The relief must have been enormous. And not metaphorical relief either. The genuine, visceral relief of people who had genuinely believed the world might end that night. There is something in this that I find deeply moving, actually. The new fire ceremony is an expression of a fundamental human anxiety, the fear that the world might simply stop, that the ordinary processes of existence might fail, that the sun might one day simply not come back. Most religious traditions address this anxiety in some form. The Aztecs addressed it with a ceremony that lasted all night and involved keeping the entire empire in darkness until the fire was relit. The darkness before the new fire, the world holding its breath, and then the torch arriving and the fires being kindled and the world continuing. That is a very human thing to do. Kings, priests, and warriors. How the empire actually worked, running an empire of several million people across a territory spanning hundreds of miles, with no wheeled vehicles, no horses, no written bureaucratic documents of the kind we would recognize, and no centralized currency beyond cacao beans and cotton cloth, is a genuinely impressive logistical achievement. The fact that the Aztec Empire was able to do this for nearly a century, maintaining control over dozens of subject peoples, extracting tribute, suppressing rebellions, and projecting military force to its farthest borders, speaks to the sophistication of its administrative and social structures. At the top of the political hierarchy sat the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, a title usually translated as speaker or he who speaks. The Tlatoani was both the political and the religious leader of the Mexica people, though he shared certain ritual functions with the priests. He was elected technically by a council of electors drawn from the noble class, the Pipiltin, but in practice the election was usually among close relatives of the previous ruler, making it a form of dynastic succession with a democratic veneer. The Spanish would translate Tlatoani as king or emperor, and by the 16th century the Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan exercised powers that were roughly commensurate with those titles. The Tlatoani was advised by a council of senior nobles and military leaders, and by the Cihuacuatl, the snake woman administrator whose office Tlacaelel had made so powerful in the early imperial period. the Cihuacoatl handled the administrative machinery of the state, tax collection, labor organization, the court system. The Cihuacoatl was, in practice, something like a prime minister, and in many periods of Aztec history the distinction between the Tlatoani's religious and military power and the Cihuacoatl's administrative power created a kind of functional separation of governance that actually worked fairly well. The nobility, the pipiltin, were the ruling class of Aztec society, distinguished from commoners by birth, by their access to the Calmecac school, where they received an elite education in religion, history, astrology, rhetoric and military arts, and by their right to wear certain luxury goods, cotton cloaks with specific designs, lip plugs and ear spools of gold and turquoise, feather ornaments of extraordinary complexity and beauty. The sumptuary laws of Aztec society were quite specific about who could wear what, and wearing goods above your station was a serious offence. But Aztec society, while clearly hierarchical, was not entirely closed. The most significant route of social mobility was military achievement. A commoner, a Masihualtin, who distinguished himself in battle, who captured 4 enemies in combat, could rise to join the warrior elite and gain access to privileges otherwise reserved for the nobility. The warrior orders, the Quachictin and the Otontin, the Eagle warriors and the Jaguar warriors, were open to exceptional commoners and represented the highest military achievement available to a man born outside the nobility. The Pochteca were a fascinating intermediate group, the long-distance merchants who operated at the edges of the empire and beyond, trading in luxury goods and gathering intelligence. The Pochteca occupied a somewhat ambiguous social position. They were not noble, but they were wealthy and powerful. They had their own patron deity, Yacatecutli, their own courts for settling commercial disputes, and their own residential neighborhoods in Tenochtitlan. They also served as a kind of unofficial intelligence service, gathering information about distant territories that the military might later conquer. The relationship between the Pochteca and the imperial administration was one of mutual benefit thinly disguised as separate activities. The vast majority of the population were the Maxwaltin, the commoners, who farmed, built, crafted and provided the labour that kept everything running. Commoners were organised through their Calpulli, which provided them with access to communal land, organised their tax obligations and maintained the local school where commoner children received an education. Yes, commoner children received an education. The Telpochcali, the young men's house, taught basic religion, civic obligation, military training and practical skills. It was not the same as the elite education available in the Calmecac, but it was genuinely educational and genuinely mandatory, which puts the Aztecs somewhat ahead of many later civilizations in terms of universal access to schooling. Below the Maxihualtin were the Mayek, a kind of tenant farmer class who worked lands belonging to the nobility rather than communal lands, and below them were the slaves, Tlacotin, who occupied the lowest rung of the social hierarchy. Aztec slavery was not racial and was not hereditary. A person might become a slave through debt, through criminal conviction, or through capture in war. Slaves could own property. They could purchase their own freedom. Their children were born free. These provisions did not make slavery a benign institution, but they did make it structurally different from the chattel slavery that the Spanish would introduce. The tribute system was the economic engine of the empire. Subject peoples paid tribute in the form of goods specific to their region. Coastal peoples paid fish and seashells. Cotton-growing regions paid cotton cloth. Highland regions paid cacao. Artisan centres paid finished goods. Warrior regions paid military service. All of this tribute flowed to Tenochtitlan, where it was documented in elaborate tribute lists and redistributed through a system of imperial storehouses. The tribute lists that survived from the Aztec period, the Codex Mendoza being the most famous, give us a detailed picture of the sheer volume of goods that flowed into the imperial capital. Tens of thousands of cloaks per year, hundreds of thousands of cacao beans, huge quantities of feathers, jade, gold, copper, rubber and foodstuffs. The Aztec capital was, among other things, a vast redistribution centre for the goods of an empire. The expanding empire. Conquest and tribute. The Aztec Empire did not expand in a straight line, and it did not expand through the same methods in every direction. This is important to understand because one of the most common misconceptions about the Aztec imperial system is that it resembled the Roman or British empires in the sense of establishing direct administrative control over conquered territories. It did not quite, and the difference is significant. The Aztec model was what scholars often call a hegemonic empire rather than a territorial one. When the Aztecs conquered a city or a people, they generally did not send Aztec administrators to run the place directly. They did not replace local rulers with Aztec governors. They did not impose the Nahuatl language on conquered populations. What they did was establish a relationship of tribute. The conquered ruler was confirmed in his position, often as a vassal, and his people were assessed a tribute obligation that was collected at regular intervals by Aztec tribute collectors called calpixc. As long as the tribute was paid, local governance, local religion, and local culture were largely left intact. This system had obvious advantages for the Aztecs. It was cheap to administer. It did not require large garrisons of occupying troops in every conquered territory. It leveraged existing local power structures rather than replacing them. And it meant that the logistical challenge of governing an enormous territory with no wheeled transport or writing-based bureaucracy was manageable. But it also had a significant vulnerability, one that would prove catastrophic when the Spanish arrived. Subject peoples who had been conquered and were paying tribute to the Aztecs were not, in most cases, enthusiastic members of the empire. They were subordinate peoples who had been defeated militarily and were paying a price for that defeat. Their local rulers retained power, but at the cost of regular tribute and the occasional demand for military service and sacrificial victims. Many of them resented it deeply, and that resentment created a pool of potential allies for anyone willing to offer them a way out. The great military commanders of the imperial expansion read almost like a royal lineage of conquerors. Itzcoatl, who founded the empire. Montezuma I, who consolidated and extended it in every direction. Axayacatl, who inherited the throne in 1469, and whose reign included both triumphs and the empire's most significant military defeat against the Tarascans to the west, a powerful and militarily sophisticated people who repelled Aztec expansion and remained an independent rival until the Spanish arrived. Tizoc, a brief and undistinguished reign, and then a Huitzotl. A Huitzotl who ruled from 1486 to 1502 was perhaps the most militarily aggressive of all the Aztec rulers, and that is saying something considerable. Under his leadership, the empire expanded to its greatest extent, reaching deep into Oaxaca, into the Gulf Coast lowlands, into Guerrero, and pushing the southern frontier into what is now Guatemala. He was the ruler who dedicated the expanded Great Temple in 1487 with the enormous sacrifice that gave historians such trouble to evaluate. He was also the ruler who managed to flood Tenochtitlan through an engineering miscalculation with an aqueduct, which is the kind of detail that history books do not include often enough, because it is a useful reminder that even great rulers of powerful empires occasionally have really bad weeks. By the time Montezuma II, the second ruler of that name, ascended the throne in 1498, the empire had reached something close to its natural limits. To the west, the Tarascans blocked further expansion. To the northwest, the Chichimec peoples of the desert were simply too mobile and too spread out to be profitably conquered. To the south, the empire had reached the edges of the Maya world, and within the existing empire, the fiscal demands of maintaining so much territory were beginning to create tensions. Montezuma II, the ruler who would face the Spanish, inherited an empire at its peak and also at the beginning of its plateau. He was a remarkable figure, and he deserves his own chapter, which he's about to get. Montezuma II, the last great emperor history, has not been uniformly kind to Montezuma II. The standard narrative of the conquest, which has shaped perceptions for 5 centuries, tends to portray him as a paralyzed figure, a man broken by superstition and fear who failed to defend his empire when defense was possible and necessary. Some accounts go further and suggest he was a coward, or a fool, or both. The truth is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, to give him his full name, which distinguished him from his grandfather Moctezuma I, was one of the most genuinely accomplished rulers the Aztec Empire ever produced. He was born around 1467 to 1468, the son of Axayacatl, and he spent his early life exactly as a young Aztec noble of his class should. He trained as a warrior. He distinguished himself in battle. He served as a priest in the Great Temple, a role that required years of austere religious devotion. By the time he came to the throne in 1498, he was a man in his early 30s who had demonstrated ability in every area that Aztec society valued. His political reforms were significant. One of the first things he did after taking the throne was to purge the palace of commoners who had risen to positions of influence under a Huitzotl, and replace them with people of noble birth. This was controversial at the time and has been interpreted variously as aristocratic conservatism and as a genuine attempt to establish more rigorous standards of governance. He also revised the legal code and took a more hands-on approach to judicial administration, reportedly sometimes disguising himself and wandering through the city to observe how his judges were actually behaving, which is either an admirable commitment to accountability or the kind of story that later admirers tended to attach to great rulers regardless of whether it actually happened. He was known for his religiosity, which in an Aztec ruler was not a sign of weakness but of spiritual authority. He fasted regularly, underwent ritual bloodletting, and maintained a strict observance of the religious calendar that gave him considerable authority with the priestly establishment. He was also known for his aloofness, his insistence on the protocols of imperial distance that required most people who encountered him to avoid meeting his eyes, to walk barefoot in his presence, to back away from him without turning. This was not personal eccentricity. It was a political and religious statement about the nature of his authority. The Tlatoani was not merely a king. He was a representative of the divine order, and the rituals of his court enacted that relationship. His military campaigns continued and extended the empire's reach. The Aztec forces under his command conquered additional territories in Oaxaca, along the Gulf Coast, and in the distant Soconusco region of what is now the border between Mexico and Guatemala. He was still actively fighting wars and winning them in the years immediately before the Spanish arrived. And then, beginning around 1502, things started happening that nobody had a good explanation for. Strange events, omens, signs in the sky and the water and the fire that the Aztec system of cosmic interpretation said meant something. The question was what? The omens. When the sky started warning people. The Aztecs were, among many other things, obsessive readers of the natural world. Everything that happened in the environment had potential significance. An eclipse was not merely an astronomical event, it was a message. A comet was not merely a rock in space trailing ice and gas, it was a sign. The flight patterns of birds, the behavior of animals, the appearance of unusual phenomena in the sky or water, all of these were potentially meaningful, and the Aztec system of divination and interpretation had developed over centuries the tools to read them. So when unusual things began to happen in the first decade of the 16th century, around the time that European ships were beginning to appear in Caribbean waters, though no one in central Mexico necessarily knew about that yet, the Aztec interpretive tradition went to work. The sources that record the omens, primarily the Florentine Codex compiled by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún in the mid-16th century based on interviews with indigenous informants, describe 8 omens that occurred in the years before the Spanish arrived. These sources were compiled after the conquest, which means they were inevitably shaped by the knowledge of what actually happened, and we should be cautious about treating them as straightforward contemporary records. The omens may have been genuine pre-conquest phenomena that were reinterpreted in light of later events. They may have been partly or largely constructed after the fact to explain a catastrophe that no one had been able to prevent. We cannot fully disentangle these possibilities, but the omens themselves are worth noting because they tell us something real about the Aztec relationship with the natural world and the cosmic order. The first omen was a comet visible in the eastern sky for a year, appearing before dawn as a tongue of fire. The second was a fire that spontaneously broke out in the temple of Huitzilopochtli, consuming it despite all efforts to extinguish it with water. The third was a lightning bolt that destroyed a thatched temple without thunder, a silent lightning strike, which was particularly alarming. The fourth was a daytime comet, or possibly multiple comets, described as falling in showers of fire from the west. The fifth was a boiling lake, the waters of Lake Texcoco churning and foaming without wind, flooding parts of the city and destroying buildings. The sixth was a woman's voice heard crying in the night, a weeping, wailing sound that said, "My children, we are lost," a figure who would later become the legend of La Llorona, the weeping woman of Mexican folklore. The seventh was a strange bird caught by fishermen, with a mirror on its head, and when Moctezuma looked into the mirror he saw armed men riding deer, which was how the Aztecs first conceptualized horses, animals they had never seen before. The eighth omen was the appearance of 2-headed people wandering the streets, whose images vanished when brought to Moctezuma. Now, I want to be clear again that these accounts were recorded after the conquest, and were almost certainly shaped by the knowledge that conquest had come. But I want to resist the temptation to simply dismiss them as fabrications, because that would be too easy. The natural world genuinely does produce unusual phenomena. Comets are real, flooding can happen, strange atmospheric effects occur, and a society trained to read these phenomena would naturally have registered them and discussed them. Whether they discussed them in exactly the terms recorded by Sahagún 50 years later is a different question. The Quetzalcoatl question is perhaps the most historically contentious issue in all of Aztec studies. The traditional narrative, which was immensely influential throughout the 20th century, holds that Moctezuma believed the Spanish might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl and his divine companions, fulfilling the prophecy of the god king's return from the east, and that this belief paralyzed his response to the Spanish invasion. This narrative appears in many early colonial sources and was for a long time accepted as historical fact. Modern scholars are considerably more skeptical. The Quetzalcoatl prophecy, in the specific form that relates it to the Spanish arrival in the year 1 read on the Aztec calendar, which was also the year that tradition associated with Quetzalcoatl's birth, may have been elaborated or even invented after the conquest as part of an attempt by indigenous intellectuals to make sense of what had happened to them. The idea that a great empire fell because its ruler thought the invaders were gods is a very convenient explanation that perhaps conveniently removes some of the agency from both Moctezuma and from the indigenous peoples who assisted the Spanish. What is clear is that Moctezuma received extensive intelligence about the Spanish from the moment they landed on the coast. He knew they were humans, he knew they came from across the sea, he knew they had weapons and animals unlike anything in the Mesoamerican experience. His response to this information was complex, cautious, and in some respects strategically sophisticated, even if it ultimately failed. Dismissing it as mere superstitious paralysis does a disservice to a man who was operating under conditions of genuinely unprecedented uncertainty. Strangers from the east, Cortés arrives. His full name was Hernán Cortés de Monroy y Pizarro Altamirano. He was born around 1485 in Medellín, in the Extremadura region of Spain, a region that produced a disproportionate number of the conquistadors who would tear apart the indigenous worlds of the Americas. This is probably not coincidence. Extremadura was a poor, dry, hard-scrabble part of Spain where the options available to an ambitious young man of minor noble birth were limited, and where the stories coming back from the New World carried enormous appeal. Cortés studied law at the University of Salamanca for a couple of years before the pull of the New World proved too strong. He sailed for Hispaniola in 1504 at age 19, and spent the following years working as a notary, participating in the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez, and accumulating the kind of colonial experience that would serve him well in the venture to come. He was charming, intelligent, politically astute, physically brave to the point of recklessness, and utterly unscrupulous when unscrupulousness served his purposes. He was also, by most accounts, genuinely charismatic in person, the kind of man who could talk almost anyone into almost anything, which was a skill he would need. The expedition to Mexico in 1519 was not technically authorized. Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, had originally commissioned Cortés to lead a trading and exploration expedition to the Mexican mainland, building on earlier expeditions that had established contact with coastal peoples and brought back intriguing reports of a wealthy civilization in the interior. But then Velázquez changed his mind about Cortés, possibly because he found him insufficiently controllable, and tried to cancel the commission. Cortés, having already assembled his fleet, his soldiers, and his supplies, sailed anyway, technically in defiance of his governor's orders. This was not a trivial act of insubordination, it was potential treason. And everything Cortés did in the months and years that followed was shadowed by the fact that he was operating without legitimate authority, which meant that success was the only thing that would save him. If he failed, or came home without something extraordinary to show for it, he faced arrest, disgrace, and possibly execution. This context is important. It explains why Cortés consistently pushed forward when a more cautious commander might have withdrawn, and why he took risks that, by any rational military calculation, he had no business taking. He had to win. There was no other option. The fleet left Cuba in February of 1519 with approximately 550 soldiers, some cavalry, a few small artillery pieces, and a number of indigenous Cuban guides and servants. It was not a large force. It was not, by any conventional military assessment, remotely adequate for conquering an empire of millions. But Cortés apparently did not think in those terms, or if he did, he concealed it very effectively. The fleet landed first on the island of Cozumel, off the Yucatan Peninsula, where Cortés encountered his first piece of extraordinary good fortune. Here he found Geronimo de Aguilar, a Spanish priest who had been shipwrecked off the Yucatan coast years earlier and had been living among the Maya ever since. Aguilar spoke Mayan. This was immediately useful. Then, as the fleet moved along the coast and fought a series of engagements with local peoples, Cortés received another gift from contingency. Among the slaves given to him after a battle with the Tabascans was a young woman who would become arguably the most important individual in the entire history of the conquest. The Spanish called her Doña Marina. History calls her La Malinche. The Aztecs called her Malintzin, and she was about to change everything. Malintzin was a Nahua speaker, which meant she spoke the language of the Aztecs, Nahuatl. She had learned Mayan during her time in captivity among the Tabascans. With Aguilar speaking Mayan and translating into Spanish, and Malintzin speaking Nahuatl and translating into Mayan, Cortés suddenly had a communication chain that reached directly into the heart of the Aztec world. It was cumbersome, it was prone to errors and mistranslations, but it worked. And it gave Cortés an enormous advantage in every negotiation, every political encounter, every attempt to understand and manipulate the complex indigenous political landscape. Meanwhile, back in Tenochtitlan, the painting system that Aztec informants maintained along the coast was already functioning. Runners carried painted reports of everything the strangers were doing back to the capital, and Moctezuma began receiving intelligence about these beings from across the water before they had advanced even a day's march from the coast. He sent emissaries with gifts, elaborate, gorgeous, extraordinarily valuable gifts, gold, featherwork, jade, the full display of Aztec imperial wealth. The gifts were intended, at least in part, as a subtle communication of power. We are rich, and we are dangerous, and you should think carefully before doing anything provocative. Cortés looked at the gifts, saw that they were gold, and decided to go inland. The march, inland, alliances, and massacres. The march from the coast to Tenochtitlan, which took roughly 5 months, is a story that deserves much more space than most popular histories give it, because it is during this march that the true shape of the conquest becomes visible. Cortés did not conquer the Aztec Empire with 500 Spanish soldiers. That would have been literally impossible. He conquered it at the head of an army that eventually numbered in the tens of thousands, the vast majority of whom were indigenous peoples who had their own reasons, their own grievances, their own political calculations that led them to ally with the strangers from the east against the rulers in Tenochtitlan. The first and most important of these alliances was with the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcala was an independent republic, one of the few polities in central Mexico that had successfully resisted Aztec conquest. It sat on a high plateau east of the Valley of Mexico, surrounded on all sides by territory controlled by or tributary to the Aztec Empire. It was, in effect, an island of independence in an Aztec sea, and the price of that independence was constant tension, constant threat, and the ongoing cost of the Flower Wars. The Tlaxcalans were tough, battle-hardened fighters who had spent generations defending themselves against the most powerful empire in Mesoamerica. When Cortés's force entered Tlaxcalan territory, the Tlaxcalans fought them, viciously and effectively. In a series of battles that lasted several weeks, the Tlaxcalan armies threw everything they had at the Spanish. And the Spanish, small in number but equipped with steel weapons, firearms, crossbows and horses, none of which the Tlaxcalans had ever encountered, held on, just barely. There were moments when the entire expedition came close to destruction, and then the Tlaxcalan leadership made a decision. If these strangers were strong enough to withstand Tlaxcalan armies and still be standing, they might be strong enough to be useful against Tenochtitlan. The political logic was simple and brutal and entirely rational. The enemy of my enemy. An alliance with Cortés offered the possibility of striking back at the Aztecs who had been bleeding Tlaxcala for generations. Through tribute demands and sacrificial requirements, the Tlaxcalan lords met with Cortés, formed an alliance, and sent him thousands of warriors. This was the single most important development of the entire conquest. Not any battle the Spanish fought, not any technological advantage they possessed. The alliance with Tlaxcala and the indigenous coalition that built around it over the following months was what made the conquest possible. The march continued, and then came Cholula. Cholula was one of the great religious centers of Mesoamerica, home to the largest pyramid by volume in the world, a structure so enormous that when the Spanish built a church on top of it, which they did, it was mistaken by later visitors for a natural hill. Cholula was not an Aztec city exactly. but it was allied with the Aztecs and its loyalties were, at best, uncertain. What happened at Cholula in October of 1519 is one of the most contested events in the history of the conquest. Cortés claimed, and his indigenous allies claimed, that they discovered a plot by Cholula's leaders to massacre the Spanish force in coordination with an Aztec army waiting outside the city. Whether this plot was real, exaggerated, or invented is something historians have been debating for 500 years. What is not disputed is what Cortés did in response. He assembled Cholula's noble leadership in the central courtyard and then, on a signal, the Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies attacked. They killed somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people in the space of a few hours. The city was sacked, the bodies were left in the plaza, and then Cortés marched onward toward Tenochtitlan. The massacre at Cholula sent a message that rippled out across the political landscape ahead of him. This man was dangerous. This man was not following the conventions of Mesoamerican warfare. And the political effect of that message was mixed. It terrified some peoples into submission and inflamed others into hostility. It was, regardless of its moral status, an effective piece of psychological warfare. La Malinche is a figure around whom enormous amounts of ink have been spilled and enormous amounts of emotion have been invested, particularly in Mexican culture, where she's been both vilified as a traitor and rehabilitated as a survivor and a historical actor in her own right. What we know of her biography is fragmentary. She was apparently of noble birth, possibly sold into slavery by her family in circumstances that are unclear. She was given to Cortés as a slave after the Tabascan battle. She learned Spanish very quickly. She became Cortés's interpreter, his diplomatic representative, and his companion, bearing him a son who is sometimes called the first mestizo, the first person of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry in New Spain, though that is obviously a symbolic designation rather than a literal one. What Malintzin was doing, at the most fundamental level, was surviving. She was operating in a world that had been overturned, in which the old rules no longer applied, in which her own people's empire was collapsing around her. Her choices were not the choices of a person with many good options. They were the choices of an extraordinarily intelligent, adaptable woman, making the best of conditions she had not chosen and could not control. The verdict of later generations, who called her La Malinche and turned her name into a synonym for betrayal, tells us more about the needs of those later generations than about the woman herself. The meeting of two worlds. Cortés enters the city. On the 8th of November, 1519, Hernán Cortés led his force along the southern causeway into Tenochtitlan. And whatever else you want to say about this moment in history, however you feel about what came before it and what came after it, the moment itself was one of the most extraordinary human encounters in the recorded past. Two civilizations that had developed in total isolation from each other, across an ocean that neither knew the other lived beyond, met face to face, on a causeway over a lake in the thin air of the Mexican highlands. Two systems of understanding the world, two cosmologies, two sets of assumptions about what was real and important and sacred and dangerous, came into contact for the first time, and the representatives of those two civilizations were, respectively, a 34-year-old Spanish adventurer of minor noble birth acting without legitimate authority from his government, and the Tlatoani of the most powerful empire in Mesoamerican history, attended by all the ceremonial magnificence his court could muster. Montezuma came out to meet Cortés on the causeway. This was itself a remarkable gesture. The Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan did not generally leave his palace to meet visitors. He received them. For him to come to the causeway was either a gesture of extraordinary honour, acknowledging that the visitor was of equivalent or superior status, or a deliberately calculated move in a political game whose full dimensions we cannot reconstruct. Possibly both simultaneously. Cortés described the meeting in his famous letters to King Charles I of Spain. Moctezuma arrived, he wrote, carried on a litter by 8 lords, walking on mats that were spread before him, so his feet never touched the ground. He was dressed in the richest garments, wearing a great quantity of gold and precious stones. 2 lords walked before him, carrying sceptres, and when he alighted from the litter, the other lords supported him by the arms on either side. The protocol of the meeting was complicated by the radically different social codes each side was operating under. In Aztec custom, looking directly at the Tlatoani was not something most people were permitted to do. Cortés, whose cultural codes told him that a proper greeting involved direct eye contact and possibly an embrace, attempted to put his arms around Moctezuma and was immediately prevented from doing so by the lords who surrounded the ruler. A piece of amber gold jewellery was placed around Cortés's neck. Through Malintzin, the two men exchanged formal speeches. We do not know, and likely never will know, exactly what was said in those speeches, because we only have accounts from one side, and those accounts were filtered through two interpreters and written down later in contexts shaped by political needs. But we know the gist. Moctezuma welcomed the strangers. He offered them accommodation in the palace of Axayacatl, the previous Tlatoani, adjacent to the great ceremonial precinct. He arranged for them to be housed, fed, and attended to. The Spanish were simultaneously dazzled and calculating. Bernal Diaz wrote his famous account of entering the city and finding himself unable to adequately describe what he was seeing, comparing it to the enchanted things related in the Book of Amadis of Gaul. He noted the towers and temples rising from the water, the extraordinary architecture, the markets, the cleanliness of everything. He also noted how many warriors were present, and the weapons he saw, and the routes of the causeways that would either allow escape or trap an army depending on what happened next. Cortés set up in the palace of Axayacatl. His Spanish soldiers and his thousands of Tlaxcalan allies were settled into the city. And a period began that can only be described as a very strange, very tense cohabitation, in which the Aztec court observed the strangers. The strangers observed the Aztec court, each side probing for information and advantage, and neither side fully understanding what the other was doing or why. Cortés was shown the great markets, the temples, the palace complexes. He climbed to the top of the Templo Mayor with Moctezuma and looked out over the city spread below him, and by his own account he was genuinely astonished at what he saw. He also told Moctezuma, upon seeing the shrines to Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc, that he found the images of these deities very disturbing and would like to place a Christian cross there. Moctezuma politely declined. There are moments when the sheer audacity of Hernán Cortés takes the breath away. Meanwhile, news reached Cortés from the coast. Spanish soldiers he had left behind had been attacked by Aztec allied forces, and several had been killed. This gave him what he decided was the necessary pretext for the most audacious move of the entire expedition: the seizure of Moctezuma. What Cortés decided to do, faced with the news of the attack on his coastal garrison, and aware of how precarious his position in the city actually was to seize the emperor. This plan was either one of the most brilliant improvised strokes in the history of warfare or one of the most insane, possibly both. Cortés marched to Moctezuma's palace with a group of Spanish soldiers, engaged the emperor in conversation through Malintzin, blamed him for the attack on the coast, and essentially told him he was under arrest. Moctezuma was to come with Cortés and live in the palace of Axayacatl under Spanish guard, and Moctezuma went. This is the moment that has most puzzled, frustrated, and divided historians of the conquest. Why did Moctezuma comply? He had thousands of warriors in the city. His guard alone numbered hundreds of men. He was, at this moment, standing in his own palace, in his own capital city, surrounded by his own people, being told by a foreigner that he was a prisoner. Why did he not simply refuse? Why did he not call his warriors? The traditional answer, shaped largely by Spanish colonial sources, is that Moctezuma was paralyzed by fear, by his belief that Cortés might be a divine emissary, or simply by personal cowardice. This explanation has the advantage of being simple, and the disadvantage of being almost certainly inadequate. A more nuanced reading suggests several possibilities. Moctezuma may have calculated that allowing himself to be held under something like house arrest, while maintaining the outward forms of his authority and continuing to conduct business through the usual channels, was less dangerous than an immediate armed confrontation that would destroy the city and kill civilians. He may have believed he could manage the situation from within the Spanish camp and extract himself from it on more favourable terms than an immediate confrontation would allow. He may have been following the logic of his cosmological system, reading the situation as one in which the appropriate response was neither submission nor resistance, but a more complex form of engagement. He continued to govern, to some extent, while under Spanish custody. Tribute continued to arrive, judicial decisions were made, religious ceremonies were observed, the machinery of empire continued to turn. Cortés was careful to treat his royal prisoner with enormous outward courtesy, encouraging the continuation of Moctezuma's ritual functions, while making clear that his freedom of movement was constrained. Among the Aztec nobility, however, reactions were more complex. Some lords counselled accommodation, others, particularly the warriors, were appalled and furious. The sight of their ruler apparently in the custody of the strangers was intolerable, but action was difficult while Moctezuma himself seemed to be acquiescing. and while the threat of immediate Spanish violence against the ruler was real. Into this already volatile situation came an additional complication. A fleet arrived from Cuba. It was sent by Governor Velázquez, who had finally received word of Cortés's unauthorized expedition and was not pleased. The fleet carried more than 1,000 soldiers and a commander named Pánfilo de Narváez, whose job was to arrest Cortés and bring him back to Cuba. Cortés left Tenochtitlan in May of 1520, leaving a garrison under a particularly aggressive officer named Pedro de Alvarado, and marched to the coast. What followed was a kind of Spanish civil war in miniature. Cortés surprised Narváez's force, captured Narváez personally, and then offered the rest of the expedition the choice between arrest and joining his force. Most of them joined. Cortés returned to the coast with a substantially larger army than he had left it with. He arrived back in Tenochtitlan to find that things had gone catastrophically wrong. The Night of Sorrows. Noche Triste. While Cortés was away on the coast dealing with Narváez, something happened inside Tenochtitlan that undid, in the space of a single afternoon, months of careful and extraordinarily dangerous political maneuvering. The man responsible was Pedro de Alvarado. Alvarado was one of Cortés's senior officers, and by most accounts, a soldier of considerable physical courage and very limited political judgment. He was tall, blonde, and apparently so striking in appearance that the Aztecs had given him a nickname, Tonatiuh, which meant the sun, which is the kind of compliment that tends to go to a person's head. Cortés had left him in command of the garrison in Tenochtitlan while he marched to the coast, which in retrospect was one of the more consequential personnel decisions of the entire conquest. What happened next is disputed in its details, and I want to be honest about that, because the sources that describe it were written by people with obvious stakes in how the story was told. But the core of it is this. It was May of 1520. The Festival of Toxcatl was underway, one of the most important festivals in the entire Aztec religious calendar, a celebration dedicated to Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli that involved elaborate ceremony, music, and above all dancing. A large gathering of Aztec nobles, priests and warriors had assembled in the sacred precinct, the great walled ceremonial complex at the heart of Tenochtitlan, to perform the ceremonial dances that were central to the festival. The participants were dressed in their finest ritual garments. They wore the most elaborate featherwork and gold ornaments. They carried the instruments of ceremony, and they were unarmed, as religious observance required. You did not bring weapons to a sacred dance. That was not a thing you did. Alvarado ordered his soldiers to attack them. The reasons he gave, or that were later attributed to him, vary depending on which source you consult. He claimed he had intelligence of a plot to massacre the Spanish garrison when the dancing was done. Some sources suggest he had been accepting payments from Aztec nobles for permission to hold the festival, and then attacked anyway, which would place the massacre somewhere in the territory of both atrocity and fraud simultaneously. Others suggest he simply panicked, that a man of his temperament, left in command of a small garrison in the middle of a city of 200,000 people, whose intentions he could not fully read, simply broke under the pressure of the situation and made the worst possible choice. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same. The Spanish and their allies moved through the sacred precinct with swords. The dancers could not defend themselves. The accounts that survive, both Spanish and indigenous, describe what followed with a consistency that is itself a kind of testimony. The Florentine Codex, compiled from indigenous accounts decades later, describes the scene in terms that I will paraphrase rather than quote directly, but that leave nothing to the imagination. Nobles who had spent their lives in positions of honour and ceremony were cut down in the precinct where their gods resided. Priests who had served those gods their entire adult lives died in the place of their service. The finest warriors in the empire, gathered for a religious festival in the heart of their own sacred city, were slaughtered because they were unarmed and therefore unable to do anything but die. The number killed is uncertain. Estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. Whatever the actual figure, the political effect was instantaneous and total. The city erupted. This, precisely this, was the thing that Cortés had spent months working to prevent. He had maintained the fiction of Moctezuma's willing cooperation. He had navigated the delicate and genuinely unprecedented situation of a small foreign garrison living under the protection of the very empire it intended to subdue. He had managed, through a combination of genuine political intelligence and constant improvisation, to keep the arrangement functioning long enough to consolidate his position. and Alvarado had ended all of it in an afternoon. Aztec warriors flooded into the streets. The Spanish garrison in the palace of Axayacatl, where they had been housed since their arrival, found itself suddenly and completely besieged. The supply lines that had kept them fed were cut. The political relationships that had kept them safe were destroyed. The city that had received them as guests, or at least as tolerated occupants, now wanted them dead. In this crisis, the Spanish turned to the one asset they still technically possessed, Moctezuma. The Tlatoani, still nominally in Spanish custody, though the nature of that custody had always been ambiguous, was brought to the roof of the palace and instructed to address his people, to tell them to stand down, to use whatever authority he still commanded to quiet the uprising long enough for some kind of negotiated exit to become possible. What happened next is one of the genuinely irresolvable mysteries of the conquest. Spanish accounts say that Moctezuma appeared on the roof and spoke to the crowd below, and that the crowd, enraged beyond the reach of his authority, threw stones at him, that he was struck, that he was wounded badly enough that he died of his injuries a few days later. Aztec accounts, recorded after the conquest, generally tell a different story. They say the Spanish killed him, that Moctezuma and several other noble prisoners were found stabbed when the Spanish finally abandoned the palace, that the stone-throwing story was a convenient invention that allowed the Spanish to avoid responsibility for the death of the man they had held captive for the better part of a year. 500 years later, we cannot resolve this with certainty. What we can say is that Moctezuma died, the most powerful ruler in Mesoamerica, in circumstances that were either a murder or a consequence of captivity so extreme that the distinction barely matters. His authority over his own people gone, his city in revolt around him, his world already irretrievably altered by the months of Spanish occupation. He ended his life in the palace of his predecessor, which had been turned into a foreign garrison, either killed by his captors or abandoned by his subjects. Neither version of his death is anything other than tragic. When Cortés arrived back in Tenochtitlan from the coast, he found a situation that no amount of political sophistication could repair. His garrison was besieged. The city was in full revolt. The alliance that had kept his small force alive in the heart of the empire was destroyed, possibly permanently. The Aztec warriors, who had been restrained by the fiction of Moctezuma's cooperation, were now fighting with the full force of their outrage. There was no path forward that involved remaining in the city. He had to get out. The retreat was planned for the night of the 30th of June, 1520. The Spanish chose their moment carefully, a rainy night with no moon, hoping that darkness and poor visibility would cover the withdrawal of what was still, after all, an enormous column of soldiers, allied warriors, equipment, horses, artillery, and gold. Yes, gold. Cortés's soldiers were carrying as much of the accumulated treasure of Moctezuma's treasury as they could physically manage, because they had not gone through all of this to leave the gold behind, which turned out to be a decision with consequences. A portable wooden bridge had been constructed to span the gaps in the causeway, where the Aztecs had removed the permanent bridges to trap exactly this kind of retreat. The plan was to move the bridge from gap to gap as the column advanced, leapfrogging their way across the lake to the western shore. They were detected almost immediately. The alarm went up, and what followed was one of the most catastrophic nights in the entire history of the conquest. Aztec warriors came from the water on hundreds of canoes, attacking the column from both sides of the causeway simultaneously. They came from the causeway itself, both ahead of the retreating Spanish and behind them, in the darkness and the rain, and the screaming confusion of close combat on a narrow elevated road over a lake in the middle of the night. Everything that could go wrong did. The portable bridge jammed at the first gap. It could not be moved. It would not be moved. The column was trapped, with the gap ahead of them and the warriors pressing from behind, and the only way forward was through the water. Soldiers jumped. Some made it. Many did not. The ones carrying the most gold were the ones who drowned first, pulled down by the weight of wealth they would not release, even as the water closed over them. The Aztec warriors in the canoes pulled survivors from the water. Some were killed, some were taken prisoner to be sacrificed later, which was the fate they would have chosen as warriors for their own enemies. By the time the survivors reached the western shore of the lake, Cortés had lost perhaps half of his Spanish soldiers. He had lost the great majority of his Tlaxcalan allies. He had lost virtually all of his artillery. He had lost most of the gold. He had lost 2/3 of his horses. Spanish chronicles record that Cortés sat beneath a great tree on the lakeshore and wept, This detail appears in multiple sources, and there is no particular reason to doubt it. Whether it was grief or relief, or simple physical exhaustion finding its release, no one recorded. The night entered history as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows. And then, and this is the part of Hernán Cortés that history has never quite known how to hold, he stood up. He looked at what remained of his force. He looked at the lake behind him and the mountains ahead of him, and the alliance in ruins around him. He counted his survivors and his remaining horses and the weapons that had made it across the causeway, and he decided in the aftermath of what was by any reasonable assessment a catastrophic defeat that he was going to try again. That decision, made on a lakeshore in the dark in the rain with the bodies of half his army still floating in the water behind him, is what the next chapter of this story is built on. The Siege of Tenochtitlan. The period between the Noche Triste and the final assault on Tenochtitlan, roughly a year, from July 1520 to August 1521, is a chapter in the story of the conquest that is often compressed or simplified, but deserves full attention because it reveals the true nature of what the conquest actually was. In the immediate aftermath of the Noche Triste, the Spanish survivors retreated to Tlaxcala, their most reliable ally. The Tlaxcalans had suffered enormous losses in the retreat and had every reason to abandon the alliance. They did not. They welcomed the Spanish, treated their wounded, resupplied their forces, and began preparing for round two. The political logic of the Tlaxcalan alliance was, if anything, stronger after the Noche Triste than before it. The Aztecs had clearly decided that the strangers were enemies, which meant that Tlaxcala's only options were to join the Aztec side or continue supporting the Spanish. Given what the Aztecs would likely do to Tlaxcala if they triumphed, the second option was the only rational one. Cortés spent the following months rebuilding his force, sending to Cuba and the Caribbean for reinforcements and supplies, and doing something genuinely brilliant from a military engineering perspective. He ordered the construction of brigantines, flat-bottomed sailing vessels capable of operating on the shallow waters of Lake Texcoco. He planned to take the lake away from the Aztecs to counter their canoe-borne warriors with vessels armed with artillery, and to cut off Tenochtitlan's supply lines across the water. 13 brigantines were constructed in pieces in Tlaxcala, dozens of miles from the lake. Then they were carried in sections across the mountains by an enormous labour force of indigenous allies, assembled at the lakeshore and launched. The logistics of this operation were extraordinary and should not be underestimated. It required vast amounts of timber, ironwork, sails and rigging. It required thousands of indigenous labourers willing to carry heavy ship components over mountain terrain. It required Cortés to maintain the cooperation of his indigenous allies through months of frustrating waiting and preparation. That he managed it is a testament to his organisational ability. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Tenochtitlan, something invisible and utterly devastating. Smallpox had arrived. The disease had been introduced to the Caribbean islands by the Spanish almost immediately after contact, and had been spreading through the indigenous populations of the Americas with catastrophic speed. It reached central Mexico sometime in 1520, probably carried by members of the Narvaez expedition or through indigenous population movements along the coast. And in Tenochtitlan, in a population with no prior exposure to the virus and therefore no immunity whatsoever, it was apocalyptic. The epidemic of 1520 to 1521 killed an estimated 30 to 50% of Tenochtitlan's population. The Tlatoani who succeeded Moctezuma, a warrior named Cuitlahuac, who had been one of the most vigorous voices for armed resistance, died of smallpox after a reign of only 80 days. Tens of thousands of civilians, warriors, priests and administrators died. The city was managing the demands of a military siege while simultaneously dealing with a disease that was killing its people faster than any army could. Cuauhtémoc, the nephew of Moctezuma, became the new Tlatoani. He was young, probably in his mid-20s, and he was determined to fight. He organized the defense of the city with skill and courage, directing the construction of barricades, organizing warrior units for counterattacks, and maintaining what morale could be maintained in a city under siege and ravaged by plague. The siege began in earnest in May of 1521. The brigantines took the lake, neutralizing the canoe fleet. The causeways were cut from the mainland. The aqueducts were destroyed, cutting off the city's fresh water supply. And then, slowly, horribly, the city was destroyed from the outside in. The Spanish and their indigenous allies fought their way along the causeways and through the neighbourhoods of Tenochtitlan, advancing yard by yard, destroying as they went. Cortés initially tried to preserve buildings, hoping to inherit the city intact. But the Aztec strategy of retreat and counterattack through the rubble made standing buildings into fortresses, and eventually Cortés gave the order to demolish everything that was captured, filling the canals with rubble to create solid ground for his forces to advance on. This was the destruction of Tenochtitlan, not an accident, not inevitable, a deliberate military choice that reduced one of the most beautiful cities in the world to a field of rubble in the course of 3 months. The Aztec defenders fought with extraordinary tenacity. There are accounts of warriors defending positions until they were literally the only person standing, of civilians joining the defense alongside soldiers, of the city fighting block by block and house by house as it was systematically destroyed around them. The suffering of the civilian population was immense, trapped without clean water, without food, without any prospect of relief, dying of smallpox and wounds and starvation, while the rubble of their city piled up around them. Cuauhtémoc organised the last resistance from the northeastern corner of the island, where the remnants of the population and the military had retreated. And then, in mid-August of 1521, a canoe was spotted trying to cross the lake with important passengers. It was captured. Cuauhtémoc was in it. The Fall, August 13, 1521. The date was the 13th of August, 1521. The day sign in the Aztec calendar was one serpent. Not that the calendar mattered much anymore. Not that anything in the old order of things had much purchase on a morning like this one, with smoke still rising from the ruins of the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere, and the silence of guns settling over a landscape that barely resembled what it had been 80 days earlier. A canoe had been spotted trying to cross the lake. It was captured, and the man inside it, brought now before Hernán Cortés, was Cuauhtémoc, the last Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, the man who had organised the defence of the city through 3 months of siege, through plague and starvation, and the systematic demolition of everything his people had built. A young man, probably in his mid-20s, standing in front of the soldier who had destroyed his world. What happened next was recorded in several sources, and has been retold many times, and I think it deserves to be told carefully, because it is one of the most genuinely affecting moments in the entire history of the conquest. And that is a history that contains no shortage of dramatic moments. Cuauhtémoc, according to the accounts, looked at Cortés and said something to this effect. "I have done everything in my power to defend my people. I have done my duty. Take me now, as you will take me, and I do not complain." He then reached out and touched the dagger at Cortés's belt, and he asked Cortés to use it to kill him. Cortés declined. He treated Cuauhtémoc as a prisoner of war, which was, under the circumstances, probably the most pragmatic available response. A dead Cuauhtémoc was a martyr. A living Cuauhtémoc was a tool, and with that organised Aztec resistance ended. The fighting stopped, and in the silence that followed, a silence that was partly the silence of spent weapons and partly the silence of a city where there was no longer enough people left alive and mobile to generate the ordinary noise of human habitation, the scale of what had happened over the previous 80 days, over the previous 2 years, became fully and finally visible. Tenochtitlan was unrecognisable. I want you to hold that word for a moment. Unrecognisable. This was a city that Spanish soldiers had walked into less than 2 years earlier with their mouths literally open, unable to find adequate words for what they were looking at. A city of 200,000 people built on water, with wide causeways and aqueducts, and a market larger than anything in Spain, and a zoo and gardens and palaces that Cortés himself described as the finest buildings in the world. That city, that specific, impossible, magnificent city was gone. The great causeways were choked with rubble. The strategy of demolishing every captured building and filling in the canals with the debris to create solid ground for the advancing forces had worked militarily and had been catastrophic in every other sense. The canals, those narrow waterways between chinampa plots through which canoes had glided carrying the commerce of an empire, were buried under stone and plaster and the debris of torn-down walls. The Templo Mayor, that great double pyramid that had dominated the skyline for nearly 2 centuries, had been partially demolished. The palaces were ruins, the markets were empty and silent. The zoo, which had so astonished the Spanish on their first arrival, those extraordinary aviaries and jaguar pens and the collections of animals that no European had ever imagined in one place, was gone. The animals were dead or had escaped or had been eaten by the starving population during the siege. The Tzompantli, the great skull rack where the heads of sacrificial victims had been displayed in their thousands, had been toppled. The streets were full of bodies, Contemporary accounts, both Spanish and indigenous, describe the same thing. Bodies in the streets, bodies in the rubble, the smell of death everywhere, the survivors too weak from starvation and disease to bury their dead. The population of what had been the largest city in the Western Hemisphere had been reduced, by battle and smallpox and starvation and flight, to a fraction of what it had been when the Spanish first walked across the southern causeway in November of 1519. Estimates vary, and we should be honest that any specific number carries considerable uncertainty, but some historians believe that the population of the city and its immediate surroundings may have fallen by 70 or 80% in the course of the siege and the epidemic that preceded and accompanied it. The Spanish walked through this landscape and began with the particular focus of men who have been through a great deal and want to know what they have to show for it, to assess what they had won. The gold was mostly gone. This was not what anyone had hoped to find. The legendary treasure of Moctezuma, the great accumulation of gold and jade and featherwork that had filled the treasury of the Tlatoani, and that the Spanish had briefly glimpsed during their stay in the city before the Noche Triste, had largely vanished. Some of it had been taken by the Spanish themselves during the chaotic retreat on that rainy June night, dropped into the lake along with its carriers when the causeway fighting began. Some had been deliberately thrown into the lake by the Aztecs to prevent it falling into Spanish hands. Some had been hidden, its location known only to people who were now dead, or who had fled, or who were not inclined to share the information. Cortés and his soldiers searched. They searched with the desperation of men who had risked everything and survived everything, and needed the reward to make sense of the cost, and they found far less than anyone had anticipated. What followed is one of the grimmer footnotes to an already grim story. There are accounts, and I want to be careful here because sources from this period are complicated and sometimes contradictory, but there are accounts of Cuauhtémoc being tortured, of his feet being burned over coals, of the Spanish trying to force from him the location of hidden gold. He endured it, apparently without yielding much of anything useful, and whether he genuinely did not know where the gold was or simply refused to say is something we cannot determine from this distance. He survived the torture. He did not survive Hernán Cortés's long-term plans. In 1525, 4 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan, Cortés had Cuauhtémoc executed while on an expedition to Honduras. The circumstances are disputed. Cortés claimed there was evidence of a plot to rebel. Others, including some Spanish observers at the time, regarded the execution as a judicial murder committed against a man who had already surrendered honourably and had been treated as a prisoner of war for 4 years. The killing of Cuauhtémoc was condemned by many even within the Spanish colonial world and has never been forgotten in Mexico. He became and remains one of the great martyred figures of Mexican national memory. There are statues of him. His name is given to streets and public squares. He is remembered as the man who did not break, who asked for the death he was denied and endured instead 4 years of captivity, followed by an execution of questionable legality. And then, on the ruins of everything Cuauhtémoc had defended, a new city was built. Not near the ruins, not adjacent to them. On them, literally on them. The rubble of Tenochtitlan became the foundation of Mexico City, the capital of New Spain, and eventually of the independent nation of Mexico. The alignment of the colonial streets followed, in many places, the alignment of the Aztec causeways and major roads beneath them. The Cathedral Metropolitan of Mexico City sits directly on top of the sacred precinct of Tenochtitlan, its foundations resting on the same ground that once held the Templo Mayor. The relationship between the city that was destroyed and the city that replaced it is not metaphorical. It is geological. It is architectural. It is, in the most literal possible sense, foundational. The empire was gone. The city was gone. The Tlatoani was captured and would soon be dead. The gods who had run the world had not intervened, or had not intervened in any way that the survivors could interpret as helpful. The fifth son, whose maintenance had been the central obligation of Aztec religious life, whose daily renewal had justified everything, every sacrifice, every flower war, every drop of blood poured out on every altar in the empire, had not been extinguished in the cosmic sense, but from the perspective of the people who had spent their lives sustaining it, who had built their entire civilization around the obligation of its maintenance, who had understood themselves as the chosen instrument of its continuation, the world that the fifth sun had illuminated was over. Whether that is the same thing as the sun going out is a question I will leave to you, in the quiet that follows this story as you settle into the dark. Why did the empire fall so fast? The question at the heart of tonight's story is the one in the title. How did an empire of millions, one of the most powerful and sophisticated political organizations in the pre-Columbian Americas, fall in roughly 2 years to a force that began with 550 soldiers? The simple answers are the ones that get repeated most often, and they are not wrong exactly, but they are insufficient. Yes, the Spanish had steel weapons and the Aztecs did not. Steel swords against obsidian-edged clubs and wooden shields is a significant military advantage, but it is not insurmountable. Obsidian is actually sharper than steel at the cutting edge, if more brittle. The Aztec warrior tradition was highly sophisticated, and steel swords do not win wars by themselves when you are facing opponents who outnumber you by thousands to one. Yes, the Spanish had horses, and the Aztecs had never seen horses before. The shock effect of cavalry in the early encounters was real and significant, but horses are also vulnerable to determined infantry with appropriate tactics, and the Aztec warriors learned to counter cavalry fairly quickly. The psychological impact of the horse was greatest in the very early stages of contact, and diminished as the war progressed. Yes, the Spanish had guns, but the early firearms of 1519 were slow to reload, inaccurate, and prone to malfunction in wet weather. Artillery was more effective but was lost on the Noche Triste and had to be replaced. Firearms were an advantage but not a decisive one in the terms usually implied. The real answer to why the empire fell is multifactorial, and each factor matters. Disease was probably the single most important element. Smallpox killed enormous numbers of Aztec defenders before and during the siege, killed the capable ruler Cuitlahuac at the moment he was most needed, and created conditions of chaos and weakness that would not otherwise have existed. A Tenochtitlan fighting the siege of 1521 without the epidemic might well have held out indefinitely, given the difficulty of taking an island city by assault. Disease did not cause the conquest, but it may well have made it possible. Indigenous alliance was equally central. The tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other indigenous warriors who fought alongside Cortés were not auxiliaries or support troops. They were the army. They supplied the numbers, the local knowledge, the logistical capacity, and the motivation that made the campaign possible. Why did they join Cortés? Because they hated Aztec rule, or feared it, or saw an opportunity to break from it. The Aztec tribute system, which extracted goods and people from subject populations, had created a vast pool of resentment that Cortés was able to mobilize. The political structure of the Aztec Empire itself created vulnerabilities. An empire held together by tribute relationships rather than direct administration was an empire that depended on the continuous display of overwhelming power to remain intact. Once that power began to look questionable, the logic of alliance with the stranger from the east became compelling to many subject peoples. The empire was not a unified national state with a citizenry emotionally committed to its survival. It was a network of coerced relationships that began to unravel as soon as a credible alternative appeared. Spanish ruthlessness played a role. The massacre at Cholula and other deliberate acts of terror reshaped the political calculations of peoples considering their options. Cortés was willing to commit atrocities at strategic moments in ways that Aztec warfare, with its emphasis on capture rather than killing, was not. This asymmetry in the use of violence had political consequences. Aztec cosmology may have played a role in ways that are genuinely difficult to assess. It is too simple to say that Moctezuma thought the Spanish were gods and was therefore paralyzed. But the Aztec framework for understanding catastrophic, unprecedented events was a religious one, and the effort to fit the Spanish into that framework, to understand what their arrival meant cosmically, may have delayed responses that might otherwise have been more effective. And then there is contingency, the simple, irreducible fact that things happen to go a certain way rather than another. Cortés might have been killed on the Noche Triste and the expedition ended. The smallpox might not have arrived when it did. The Tlaxcalan alliance might have broken down. Cuauhtémoc's canoe might not have been spotted. History is full of moments when things could have gone differently, and the conquest of Tenochtitlan is a story saturated with such moments. The question of why the empire fell so fast then does not have a single answer. It has many answers, all of them partial, all of them necessary, none of them sufficient alone. What is clear is that the story of the conquest is not the story of a handful of Spanish soldiers defeating a primitive civilization with superior technology. It is the story of a catastrophic collision between two worlds, in which disease, political fragmentation, indigenous alliance politics, Spanish tactical genius, and a great deal of very bad luck combined to produce an outcome that nobody, at any point in the process, had clearly foreseen. what the Spanish destroyed and what survived. The physical destruction of Tenochtitlan was, in some respects, the least of what was lost. In the decades that followed the conquest, as Spanish colonial administration consolidated its grip on the former empire, a systematic cultural destruction took place that was in many ways more thorough and more deliberate than anything that had happened during the actual fighting. The Spanish colonial project was not merely political. It was explicitly and self-consciously a project of religious conversion and cultural replacement. The indigenous peoples of Mexico were to be made Christian, and making them Christian was understood to require the destruction of everything that competed with Christianity for their spiritual allegiance. The burning of the codices was one of the great acts of cultural destruction in human history. The Aztec and other Mesoamerican codices were accordion-folded books made of bark paper or deer hide, painted with a combination of pictographic and phonetic script that encoded historical records, religious calendars, astronomical observations, ritual instructions, tribute lists, and narrative accounts of events. They represented the accumulated intellectual heritage of a civilization. Many were burned. The most infamous act of codex destruction was carried out by Bishop Juan de Zumárraga in Texcoco in 1530, reportedly overseeing the burning of a large collection. The Franciscan friar Diego de Landa famously burned Maya books in Yucatan in 1562, and then spent years afterward regretting it and trying to reconstruct what had been lost, which is a fairly eloquent summary of the colonial project in general. By the end of the 16th century, the vast majority of Mesoamerican codices had been destroyed. What survived is, in the circumstances, remarkable. A small number of pre-conquest codices survived, either because they were in private collections, hidden, or overlooked. The Codex Borgia, the Codex Vienna, the Codex Dresdensis, the Codex Mendoza, compiled shortly after the conquest but drawing on pre-conquest information, and a handful of others. These surviving documents are among the most intensely studied artifacts in the field of Mesoamerican studies, because each one contains enormous amounts of information that cannot be found anywhere else. More importantly, knowledge survived in human beings. Spanish friars who were genuinely interested in indigenous culture, particularly the extraordinary Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún, undertook systematic projects of documentation that preserved enormous amounts of information about Aztec life, religion, language, and history that would otherwise have been entirely lost. Sahagún's Florentine Codex, compiled in the 1560s and 70s through extensive interviews with indigenous informants, is 12 volumes of encyclopedic information about Aztec civilization, and is one of the greatest ethnographic documents in human history. The irony that so much of what we know about the Aztecs was preserved by the representatives of the religion that destroyed them is not lost on anyone who studies this period. The Nahuatl language survived and continues to be spoken by more than 1 million people in Mexico today. This is a fact worth sitting with. The language of the Aztecs, the language in which the priests chanted their hymns, and the poets composed their verses and the traders haggled in the markets of Tlatelolco is still spoken. It is a living language with living speakers. The civilization was destroyed, the language endured, words from Nahuatl entered Spanish and then, through Spanish, entered English. Chocolate comes from chocolatl. Tomato comes from tomatl. Avocado comes from ahuacatl. Chili comes from chili. Coyote comes from coyotl. These are words so familiar to English speakers that we use them without a thought, without any awareness that they are echoes of a civilization that the European world tried very hard to erase. Every time you order guacamole, you are using a Nahuatl word. Every time you eat a tomato, you are consuming something that the Aztecs were eating when Europe had never heard of it. These are small things, but they are real things, and they matter. The practice of human sacrifice was ended by the Spanish. This is a fact that complicates the simple narrative of pure cultural loss, because it is a practice that caused real suffering to real people. The ending of institutionalized sacrifice was not a uniformly bad thing, even though it came packaged with colonialism, exploitation, forced conversion, and the wholesale destruction of a civilization. History is not a simple story of good and evil, and the Aztec case is a reminder of that complexity in particularly acute form. The syncretic culture that emerged from the collision of Aztec and Spanish civilization was neither purely one nor purely the other. The Virgin of Guadalupe, arguably the most important religious figure in Mexico today, appeared in a vision to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531 on a hill that had previously been sacred to the Aztec goddess Tonantzin. Whether this coincidence was a form of cultural survival, indigenous people maintaining connections to their own sacred landscape through the medium of a new religion, or something else entirely, is a question that generations of scholars and believers have approached from very different directions. What is clear is that Mexican Catholicism bears the imprint of the religious traditions it absorbed and transformed. The cultural synthesis that resulted from the conquest is sometimes called mestizo culture, and it is the culture of modern Mexico. It is neither Aztec nor Spanish. It is something that emerged from the collision of the two, something that carries the weight of both traditions and the trauma of the encounter between them, something that is still being worked out, still being renegotiated, in the culture and politics and art of Mexico today. The legacy of the Aztecs, then, now, and forever. In 1978, a group of electrical workers digging a trench in the historic center of Mexico City struck something with their equipment. It turned out to be the edge of an enormous carved stone, more than 10 feet in diameter, depicting the dismembered body of the goddess Coyolxauhqui. The Coyolxauhqui stone that had once stood at the base of the Templo Mayor, the very same stone upon which the bodies of sacrifice victims had landed after being rolled down the temple steps, had been lying under the streets of Mexico City for 4.5 centuries. The discovery triggered an extraordinary archaeological project, the excavation of the Templo Mayor, which continues to this day. Beneath the streets of one of the world's largest modern cities, the foundation stones of the greatest temple of the Aztec world had been waiting, preserved by the rubble that the Spanish had piled on top of them in 1521. The excavation has produced thousands of artifacts and has fundamentally changed our understanding of Aztec religion, ritual, and urban life. You can visit the Templo Mayor today. You can walk among the exposed foundation layers of the Great Temple, seeing the successive rebuilding stages, each one enclosing the one before it, like the growth rings of a tree. The museum attached to the site houses an extraordinary collection of artifacts. The Coyolxauhqui stone, offering deposits containing hundreds of objects, marine shells, coral, jade, obsidian, ceramic figures, the bones of animals and humans. It is one of the most important archaeological sites in the world, and the fact that it is in the middle of a city of 22 million people is one of the more surreal aspects of its existence. The flag of Mexico bears the eagle on the cactus, the founding vision of Tenochtitlan. The national emblem of Mexico is the direct descendant of the symbol that a priest named Tenoch saw on a mudflat in a lake 7 centuries ago. Mexico's name itself probably derives from Mexica, the name the Aztecs used for themselves. The country is literally named after the people who built the civilization that the Spanish destroyed. The National Museum of Anthropology in Chapultepec Park in Mexico City is by general consensus one of the greatest museums in the world, and its Mexico halls contain the most important collection of Aztec artifacts anywhere on Earth. The famous Aztec calendar stone, often called the Sunstone, which is not actually a calendar in the functional sense but a complex religious monument incorporating calendrical symbolism, stands at the center of the Mexico Hall and has become one of the most recognized images in Mexican cultural identity. Millions of people visit the museum every year, Mexican citizens and tourists from around the world, to stand in front of objects made by the hands of people who lived and died in the city that once stood where Mexico City now stands. The Aztec presence in Mexican culture is simultaneously everywhere and complicated. Everywhere, because the archaeological heritage is genuinely extraordinary, because the Nahuatl language continues to be spoken, because the imagery of the eagle and feathered serpent and the pyramid appear in art and architecture and popular culture with remarkable frequency. Complicated, because the relationship between modern Mexicans and the Aztec past involves questions of identity, of cultural ownership, of the relationship between indigenous heritage and mestizo identity, and of how to reckon honestly with a civilization that was both genuinely magnificent and genuinely brutal. Mexico's most famous 20th century artist, Diego Rivera, covered the walls of the National Palace with murals depicting Aztec civilization in its full complexity, placing the Aztecs and their world at the center of a narrative of Mexican national identity. The murals show the markets of Tlatelolco and the pyramid of the Templo Mayor and the agricultural engineering of the Chinampas, with a reverence that is also, inescapably, a political statement about who Mexicans are and where they come from. Descendants of the Aztecs are still here. The Nahua peoples who share the language and many of the cultural traditions of the pre-conquest Mexica number several million people in Mexico today. They are not simply survivors of the conquest. They are the living continuation of a civilization, adapted and transformed by 5 centuries of colonial and post-colonial history, but never extinguished. Their presence is the most important and the least acknowledged aspect of the Aztec legacy. The Aztecs also left a philosophical and cosmological legacy that continues to fascinate scholars and thinkers. The concept of Nepantla, a Nahuatl word meaning something like the in-between space, the threshold, the state of being torn between two worlds, has been adopted by the Chicano intellectual tradition, and particularly by the writer Gloria Anzaldúa, as a framework for understanding the experience of people who exist between cultures. The word comes from the same language as the warriors who defended Tenochtitlan in 1521. The ideas it carries are still alive, still productive, still helping people make sense of their experience. The Aztec Sunstone, that great carved monument that the Spanish buried, and the 19th century Mexicans rediscovered, and the Museum of Anthropology now displays, has become one of the most reproduced images in the world. It appears on everything from tourist merchandise to academic publications to tattoo designs to album covers. Most people who encounter it have only the vaguest sense of what it actually is, or what it meant to the people who made it. But its power as an image persists. Something about it speaks to something in the human imagination that transcends cultural familiarity. And the story of the Aztecs, the story of a people who arrived as nobodies and built something extraordinary, who looked at a mudflat in a lake and saw the center of the universe, who built a city on water that left conquerors speechless with astonishment, who sustained their world with blood and flowers and the daily labor of hundreds of thousands of people, and who lost everything in 2 years to a catastrophe that no cosmological framework had equipped them to anticipate. That story continues to matter. It matters because it is a story about human ambition and human fragility, about what civilizations can build and how quickly they can fall, about the things we lose when a culture is destroyed and the things that, against all odds, survive, about the responsibility we have to the past, to the complexity of the past, to the insistence that the people of the past were real and complicated and worth understanding on their own terms. It matters because it happened, and because the people it happened to are still here, in their descendants, in their language, in the soil of Mexico City, in the symbols on the flag, in the words we use every day without knowing where they came from. And so, we have come to the end of a very long journey. We began in the deep past of Mesoamerica, with the Olmecs carving their enormous heads on the Gulf Coast, and Teotihuacan rising improbably from the valley floor to become one of the greatest cities in the ancient world. We watched the Mexico arrive in the Valley of Mexico as nobody in particular and proceed, through a combination of military skill, political genius, religious conviction, and sheer stubborn persistence, to build something that left the most powerful soldiers in Europe standing on a causeway with nothing adequate to say. We walked through the streets of Tenochtitlan when it was the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere. We visited the great temple and the markets of Tlatelolco and the floating gardens of the lake. We met the gods who ran the world and the priests who served them and the warriors who fed them with blood. We encountered the Tlatoani in his palace and the Macahualtin farmer in his chinampa field. We watched strangers arrive from the east, and we watched slowly and painfully the collision that followed. The alliances and the betrayals and the massacres and the desperate retreats. The plague that moved invisibly through a population that had no defense against it. The brigantines crossing the mountains on human shoulders. The siege, the smoke and the rubble and the silence. And then we looked at what survived. The language, the flag, the words in our everyday speech, the descendants who are still here, the archaeology that continues to reveal, layer by layer, what lies beneath the streets of Mexico City, the art and the literature and the living culture that carries the weight of all of this history, 5 centuries and counting. It is a lot to carry, and it is remarkable how much has been carried. I want to say something before we close, something that I hope will accompany you into sleep. The Aztec world was not simply a world of sacrifice and blood and conquest, though it was those things. It was also a world of extraordinary beauty, of poets who wrote about flowers and death with equal tenderness, of astronomers who tracked the movements of Venus across the sky with a precision that astonishes modern scientists, of engineers who built a city on water that should not have existed, of farmers who coaxed multiple harvests from an artificial lake bed, of children who went to school in a society that thought education was important enough to make it mandatory, of ordinary people who loved their families and feared their gods and hoped for rain and celebrated the new fire and went to sleep each night in a city that was, by any measure, one of the great human achievements of its time. That world is gone. It was ended by a catastrophe, and between the way it ended and the things it did while it existed, there is a great deal to reckon with and a great deal to grieve and a great deal to simply hold in the mind with appropriate humility. But it was real. It was here. And in more ways than we usually acknowledge, it is still here. Now let the story begin its retreat. Let the causeways dissolve back into the lake they once crossed. Let the markets quiet, the merchants packing their goods, the canoes pulling away through the reeds. Let the sound of drums from the Templar Mare grow softer, more distant, absorbed into the general hum of the city at rest. Let the great eagle on the cactus fold its wings and settle into stillness, its serpent prey motionless, the whole image held in the warm amber of the late afternoon light. Tenochtitlan breathes in the quiet before evening. Smoke rises from the cooking fires of 1,000 households. The lake reflects the mountains on the horizon, snow-capped and still. Somewhere a child is laughing. Somewhere a poet is finding words for the particular beauty of a flower that will be dead by morning. Somewhere a warrior is cleaning his weapons. Somewhere a priest is watching the stars. The fifth sun continues its journey across the sky. Not forever. Nothing is forever. But tonight, this night, the fire still burns. The sun will rise again tomorrow. The debt is paid. The world continues. You're very tired now, and that is entirely as it should be. We have travelled a long way together tonight, across many centuries and many miles. You have seen things that most people never take the time to look at properly. And now there is nothing left to do but let the story settle into the deep quiet where all the best stories eventually live. Let your body grow heavy. Let the images of today, the canoes and the causeways and the temples and the markets, blur into the softer shapes that the mind makes when it is releasing its grip on the waking world. The eagle is still on the cactus, the city is still on the lake, the fifth sun is still burning, and you are almost asleep. Good night.